The darkness comes first, not the comforting kind that hides you from the cold, but the kind that presses heavy, suffocating, and alive with whispered threats. Then comes the smell: smoke, rot, and sweat. The alleys of London at midnight. Streets that pretend to sleep. Somewhere beyond the corner, a boy sharpens a knife through the thin light of a flickering lamp. Another laughs, the kind of laughter that drips with malice, too human to be safe. Boots scrape on cobblestones. Chains rattle. The gangs are awake, and the night answers them with hunger. It is the late Victorian age, a city glittering on the surface, festering underneath. The same policemen who swore to protect lives now measure survival by the turn of a coin. The same families who pray for safety now tremble for the door. In the alleys and back streets, they call it the street's law, a code that turns loyalty into terror and terror into power. They said it was honor, they said it was brotherhood, but honor has teeth and brotherhood kills. The gangs move like shadows that remember every slight, every debt, every wound. So tonight, keep your windows shuttered and your breath low, because this is where it began, the reign of the streets, where fear walked in boots and every corner hid a ghost. Subscribe and stay with me. There are more streets to explore, more histories to haunt, and more nights where shadows never sleep. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? The city's voice is closer than you think. The fog comes like a thief. It doesn't drift, it crawls, thick as wool and heavy with the stink of coal, rotting fish, and something that might be blood. It slips through keyholes and under doors, filling parlors and alleyways with the color of sickness. The lamps along Whitechapel Road glow faintly behind it, pale halos that dissolve as quickly as they appear. London breathes in the darkness and exhales smoke. Somewhere far down the street, a whistle blows. One sharp note, thin as a bone. It's not the police this time, it's a signal. A shopkeeper bolts his door. A woman pulls her child indoors. The gangs are awake again. Boys no older than 14, with caps pulled low and razors stitched into the brims, move through the mist in packs. They are barefoot, hungry, and laughing the way wolves do when they find a scent. Their names shift from borough to borough, the High Rip Boys, the 40 Thieves, the Lambeth Lads, but in the fog, they are all the same creature. Every sound becomes something else at night. A bottle breaking might be a warning. A footstep too close means a debt is being collected. The rattle of a carriage chain echoes like distant gunfire, and the city flinches. No one trusts the fog, not even those who rule it. Because London at night is more than streets and bricks. It is alive, breathing through its sewers, whispering through its chimneys, waiting for someone to fall. Down near Spitalfields Market, the height stalls are closed, but the smell of fruit and sweat still lingers. This is where it starts, in the half-light between poverty and pride. A boy named Callum, no taller than the table he steals from, lifts a loaf from a baker's cart and runs. Behind him, another boy whistles twice, once for danger, once for direction. They vanish into the alley as if swallowed by the fog itself. The constable won't bother chasing. He knows better. The alleys here are older than the law. A mile away, in a tavern whose sign has long since fallen, a man counts coins on a splintered table. His hands are scarred, his knuckles broken so many times they no longer straighten. The others around him wait for orders. Tomorrow, they'll break a rival's jaw or rob a carriage before dawn. Tonight, they drink gin that burns like acid and talk about the way things used to be when men fought with fists instead of knives, when loyalty still meant something. But no one really believes that anymore. In London's underbelly, loyalty dies as easily as light. The fog thickens toward midnight. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rings 12 times, slow, deliberate, final. A woman screams once, then nothing. The gangs move faster now, their footsteps muffled by the damp. From the tenement windows above, 1,000 eyes watch but do not see. Fear is a language everyone speaks, and tonight it tells them to stay silent. By morning, the fog will lift, and the papers will call it another incident. They will print the word ruffians and criminal class as if it explains the hunger, the cold, the endless fight to exist. But when the next night falls, the fog will return quiet, patient, and familiar, wrapping its arms around the city it never truly leaves. Because here in Victorian London, the streets never sleep. They only hide, waiting for the next footstep, the next scream, the next breath of the fog that never left. It begins with footsteps, always footsteps. At first, they blend with the rain, with the steady drip of gutters overflowing from the night before. But soon they separate, multiply, grow louder, boots striking stone with a rhythm too deliberate to be the sound of a drunkard staggering home. That sound means something in London: ownership, territory, warning. The boys who make that noise are barely men, but in the slums of Spitalfields and Limehouse, they walk like soldiers returning from victory. Each pair of boots tells a story, some patched with rope, others stolen from corpses fished out of the Thames. The gangs wear them like crowns. To walk loudly here is to announce your existence. To walk silently is to admit fear. In the grey drizzle of morning, the market vendors are setting up, their breath white against the cold. The first light of day struggles through the haze, carving thin silver lines along the cobbles. A grocer mutters a prayer as he lifts his shutters. He's seen what comes after the sound of boots: broken crates, missing apples, sometimes blood. He keeps a coin aside every week for the boys who call themselves watchers. They aren't policemen, but they do their own kind of keeping. By the churchyard wall, a boy named Finn leans with his hands deep in his pockets, watching everything and nothing. He's small, thin, but his eyes are older than his years. When the boots echo near him, he doesn't flinch, he listens. He knows who's coming by the weight of their stride. That heavy one, dragging slightly, that's Burke, the butcher's son, who swings a blade faster than he thinks. The quicker rhythm behind him is Lyle, whose grin is as sharp as his knife. Together, they lead a pack of 10. They move through Petticoat Lane like wind over glass, shaking coins from pockets, bread from baskets, and fear from those who thought morning meant safety. They don't kill unless they must, but in London, must is a flexible word. The city itself seems to approve, echoing their footsteps through the narrow lanes like applause. At the corner, a constable appears tall, nervous, trying to remember the names written in his report. He sees the gang and hesitates. He's alone. They know it. The boys slow their march just enough to make him sweat. The sound of their boots stops. The silence stretches thin as a thread. Then, with perfect cruelty, they all take one step forward at once, the sound like thunder under wet brick. The constable turns away. His lantern sways once before vanishing into the fog. By midday, the rain returns. The gangs melt into doorways, their laughter low and mean. Somewhere, a church bell tolls, but no one listens. The boots will sound again at dusk, different streets, same rhythm. The people of London will learn to count the steps by heart, knowing when to bolt their doors and when to pray. In the evening, the boots come back from the docks, wet with river mud, heels clicking in, triumph. They've found new work, carrying crates for smugglers, guarding whiskey shipments, threatening dockmasters who forget their debts. The sound changes now, heavier, wealthier, louder, and when the sun finally dies behind the smoke of the city, London belongs once more to those who walk without fear. The rest of the world sleeps, but the gangs measure their power in echoes, each footstep a declaration that they are still here, that the law is still far away, and that the sound of boots will never stop. The knife speaks first. Before the mouth opens, before the fist clenches, the blade already has a story to tell. It flashes under the dim gaslight like a whispered curse, glinting through the fog as if the city itself were baring its teeth. In Victorian London, language was divided. Those with words ruled the parlours, those with knives ruled the streets. A boy can't learn to read, but he can learn to cut. The alleys are his schoolroom. The lessons are quick and final. The first rule is silence. The second is speed. Everything after that is survival. The gangs keep their blades in strange places, behind belts, in boot heels, tucked into the brim of a cap. A proper street boy never draws too soon. He lets fear do the talking first. When a blade finally appears, it's not a threat, it's punctuation. The end of a sentence no one dares to finish. Down in the maze of Limehouse, the air tastes of smoke and tar. Dockhands argue in 6 different tongues. But the gangs need no translation. One gesture, a tilt of the head, a hand brushing a coat pocket says enough. A fight doesn't begin with anger here. It begins with calculation. Who's watching? How many exits? Whose blood is worth spilling? When it happens, it's fast, one silver flash, one gasp, one heartbeat too long. The knife goes in clean, comes out red, and disappears into fog before the sound even reaches the next street. There's a man the boys call Cutter Jack. He's not old, but his eyes have gone glassy, like a man who's forgotten the taste of peace. He trains the younger ones the way a priest trains choir boys. Not in faith, but in rhythm. He shows them how to move the wrist, how to hold the blade low, how to smile when you cut, not because you enjoy it, but because it confuses the other man. Cutter says a knife is a mirror. It shows you what kind of person you are. Most boys stop looking after the second fight. The city keeps count, even when the papers don't. Somewhere, between Spitalfields and Clerkenwell, there's always a pool of water that isn't water anymore. The fog hides it, but the dogs can smell the truth. The morgues fill quietly, one name at a time, while the constables scratch unknown in their ledgers until the ink runs thin. By morning, the same alleys that echoed with screams are swept clean, the same corners ready for business. Life, death, and silence, all part of the routine. London pretends not to notice. The rich talk of morality while buying stolen watches in the back rooms of their clubs. The poor simply watch their children grow harder, faster, meaner. Everyone learns to step aside when a glint of steel catches the light. The knife has become the city's heartbeat, steady, cold, and always waiting. By nightfall, the fog returns, swallowing the shouts and the footsteps. In that quiet, the blades whisper to one another, in a language only the desperate understand. It's the sound of hunger, of anger, of a city cutting itself open to stay alive. And if you listen closely, somewhere beneath the hum of gaslight and the breath of rain, you can still hear it, the language of knives, sharp and eternal, spelling London's name one wound at a time. The name started as a joke, a phrase shouted after a brawl that left one man stripped to his shirt, his pockets turned out, and his pride bleeding on the pavement. High Rip, they called it, because the victim's coat had been torn clean from his back. But the joke didn't stay funny for long. Within months, it became a name that made even the police cross the street. The High Rip boys had arrived. They came from Liverpool first, drifting south with the ships, following work that never lasted and trouble that always did. By the time they reached London, they had already learned how to move like smoke together, invisible until they chose not to be. They weren't just pickpockets or drunks, they were organized, and that made them dangerous. The High Rip boys weren't a gang, they were an infection. In the East End, their legend spread faster than the fog. Dockworkers swore they saw 10 of them drag a man into an alley and vanish before the next bell rang. Merchants whispered their name like a curse when their shutters were broken. The police described them as feral, but even feral animals fight for food, not territory. The High Rip boys fought for control. Their leader was said to be a man named Burke, not his real name, surely, but one that fit too well to change. He had a jaw like a brick wall, and a voice that never rose above a murmur. People leaned in to hear him, and that's how he liked it. When you leaned in, you couldn't run. Burke believed in 3 things: fear, loyalty, and spectacle. Every attack had to be remembered. Every mark had to carry the message. They dressed better than most. Stolen coats, polished boots, and caps tilted with precision. They liked to look respectable before they broke your ribs. They'd walk into a pub quiet as church, order gin, and leave the floor slick with someone's blood. It wasn't cruelty for its own sake, it was a performance. The High Rip boys wanted London to know who ran the streets after dark. One night in Whitechapel, a shopkeeper refused to pay for protection. The next morning, his window was painted red, not with paint, but with a bucket of pig's blood. A week later, his son was found in the river. After that, the rest of the street began paying on time. It was business, plain and simple, and Burke kept his word. Once you paid, the High Rip boys protected you from everyone else, including themselves. The police tried raids, curfews, even mass arrests, but the fog always helped them disappear. One constable swore he saw them slip through walls. Another said they melted into the crowd. The truth was simpler. The High Rip boys didn't vanish, the city simply looked away. At night, they met in the upper room of a warehouse by the docks. The air smelled of whiskey and salt. Maps of the East End covered the table, each street marked with coins and buttons, symbols of who paid, who resisted, who would soon be gone. Burke tapped the table once, and silence fell. Every boy waited. Orders came soft, like prayers. By dawn, they'd be carried out. When the papers finally caught up, they called it a plague of roughs. The word gang wasn't strong enough yet, but in the alleys of London, everyone already knew what it meant. The High Rip boys weren't just criminals, they were the city's reflection, sharpened by poverty and pride. And somewhere between the fog and the docks, their laughter still echoes, quick, cruel, and certain, the sound of power learned too young and wielded too well. They said the Mohawks were gone, a savage memory of the previous century, when masked gentlemen stalked the midnight streets for sport, slicing faces and rolling drunks into gutters. But London, like any beast, remembers how to bare its teeth. In the narrow veins of Whitechapel and Holborn, a new generation picked up where the old one left off. They called themselves many things: the roughs, the dandies, the street dukes. But the newspapers knew the truth. The Mohawks were back. These new Mohawks didn't come from drawing rooms or clubs. They were born in cellars, raised on gin and debt. Their fathers were dockers, their mothers laundresses. But they had something the old gangs didn't: desperation mixed with style. They dressed better than they could afford, their coats patched but pressed, their scarves tied with flair. A blade might hang from one pocket, a poem from another. They liked to confuse people, to make violence seem elegant, like a dance performed under gaslight. By 1885, London was swelling beyond itself. More people, less space, the smell of sweat and soot layered like paint. The streets became stages, and the Mohawks were its players. They gathered in groups of 4 or 5 near the theatres and taverns, leaning against lampposts, watching. They didn't fight for territory like the High Rip boys, or trade in protection like the Lambeth lads. They fought for the thrill, for the beautiful terror of being noticed. A woman named Clara once saw them from her window above a hat shop on Drury Lane. 5 of them, dark coats, white gloves, laughter like glass breaking. One took a gentleman's cane, another lifted his hat in a mock bow. Then the tallest drew a blade so fine it shone blue beneath the lamplight. The man tried to speak, but they only laughed. They didn't rob him. They didn't even touch him. They just let the silence build, then vanished into the fog. It wasn't theft, it was theatre. At the corner of Fleet Street, a journalist named Mr. Havisham began to write about them. His articles called them the ghosts of old London, born again. He said their eyes glowed with the cruelty of leisure. Even though most had never known leisure at all, the public devoured every word. Fear sold papers, and the Mohawks provided it nightly. Before long, every bruised face in the city became their work, every broken window their signature. The legend grew faster than the truth. But beneath the poetry and the panic, there was hunger. They lived in rooms with no windows, where rats gnawed through wallpaper. They fought not for pleasure, but to feel alive, to claim some small control in a world that had forgotten them. When they beat a man senseless, they didn't think of cruelty. They thought of the rent due Monday, the cold floor waiting, the soup that never filled the bowl. Violence became proof that they still existed. By the winter of 1886, The police patrolled in pairs, then in threes. Curfews were whispered about but never kept. You could hear the city holding its breath after dark, waiting for the laughter that meant the Mohawks had returned. Some nights, a scream would rise and fade beneath the toll of Big Ben, and by morning, the fog would roll in again, wiping the slate clean as if London itself preferred not to remember. They vanished, like all things in the city do, absorbed, renamed, and forgotten. But sometimes, when the lamps flicker and the cobblestones glisten with rain, you can almost see them still elegant, dangerous, and half-smiling, as if they know that cruelty never truly dies in London. It merely changes its clothes. Not every thief in Victorian London wore boots or carried a blade. Some wore silk gloves, some wore perfume, and some, like the women of the 40 Elephants, stole the world while the city wasn't looking. They came from the south, from the narrow streets near Elephant and Castle, where the smoke of the factories curled low, and the air always smelled faintly of soap and sorrow. Most of them began as maids or laundresses, women paid in pennies and treated like shadows. But in a city that worshipped appearance, they learned how to turn that invisibility into power. If men ruled the alleys, the 40 Elephants ruled the shop floors. Their leader was a woman named Mary Carr, though she preferred Moll Cutpurse. She wasn't the first to use the name, but she made it hers. Under her, the gang moved like clockwork, organized, elegant, and terrifyingly efficient. They worked in daylight, in corsets laced tight enough to hide stolen goods beneath layers of crinoline. Some stitched secret pockets into their petticoats. Others wore coats lined with thin lead weights to drop quickly if the police came too near. They dressed better than their victims. Walking through West End stores, they looked like the wives of clerks or the daughters of gentlemen. No one suspected until a clerk turned and saw an empty jewelry tray, a vanished purse, a missing coat. By then, the women were gone, replaced by their reflections in the glass. Unlike the rough street boys, the 40 Elephants had rules. They never drank before a job, never worked alone, and always shared their spoils. The money went to rent rooms, pay doctors, feed children, and buy more dresses, because clothing was their camouflage. When they left their quarters at dawn, they looked like angels of mercy. By nightfall, they were legends. The police hated them, but they also admired them. There was no noise, no broken windows, no blood in the gutter, just vanished property and whispers of perfume left behind. Scotland Yard formed a special unit to track them, men in stiff collars who followed false trails through milliners and dressmakers, always one step too late. The 40 Elephants knew every safe house, every back door, every constable's routine, but the power that made them untouchable also made them dangerous. Rival gangs wanted a share. Men who thought they could tame them learned quickly what happens when you underestimate a woman with a blade in her garter. There's a story, half truth, half legend, of a man who struck one of them near Charing Cross. The next morning, his carriage was found overturned, the horses cut loose, the man himself stripped to his waistcoat and tarred with perfume. The scent lingered for weeks. By the 1890s, the 40 Elephants were an empire. They sent younger girls to learn the trade, expanded into burglary, even blackmail, but through it all, their code stayed the same. No man leads, no sister left behind. London's Underworld called them the lady gangsters. The papers called them a menace in lace. But the truth was simpler. They were survivors who learned how to weaponize grace. When the city finally slept, the women gathered under the railway arches, their laughter carrying above the hum of trains. Coins clinked in their pockets, jewels gleamed beneath candlelight, and the fog settled low like a curtain closing after the night's performance. Somewhere above them, respectable London dreamed of virtue and law, but beneath the streets, the 40 Elephants were already awake, sewing new pockets, sharpening new blades, and smiling in the dark, proof that in a city built on theft, the cleverest thieves wore corsets, not coats. There were no books in the alleys, no law to read, no scripture to follow. Yet every man, woman, and child who walked those narrow lanes knew the rules. They were passed down in whispers, learned by heart long before the constable's laws ever reached these streets. It was the code of the alleys, unwritten, unbreakable, and older than the gas lamps that flickered above them. It began with silence, the first and most sacred rule. You never told. Not the name of a thief, not the corner of a deal, not even what you'd seen by accident. The gangs lived and died by it. A single word to the police could cost your tongue, sometimes more. Those who broke the rule were marked. Some vanished, others were left where everyone could see them, a lesson carved in the language of fear. The alleys remembered betrayal longer than they remembered names. The second rule was debt. Every favor had a price, even the smallest one. A man might give you bread, but someday he'd ask for your silence. A woman might hide you from the constable, but her brother might call it in when he needed muscle for a fight. Nothing came free, not even mercy. In London's underworld, kindness was just a loan with interest. And then there was loyalty, the only currency worth more than gold. Gangs changed, leaders fell, but loyalty kept you breathing. To stand by your own, no matter the cost, was to belong. The boys from Limehouse, the women from the 40 Elephants, even the dock gangs from Bermondsey all obeyed it. You fought for your own, you lied for your own, you bled together, and when one fell, the rest avenged him. That was the closest thing the alleys had to honor. Every district had its own variations. In Whitechapel, the rule was never steal from a neighbor. In Southwark, it was never kill without cause. But cause was a loose word, a stolen coin, a bad look, a broken promise. And when the fog thickened, those lines blurred until justice and revenge were the same thing. The constables wrote reports about these codes, trying to understand. They thought it was chaos, random, and savage. But to those who lived inside it, there was order, the kind the law could never give. A boy who grew up under that code learned to read faces faster than words. He could tell by a man's shoes if he'd draw a blade or run. He could tell by a glance if someone would help him or sell him. And if he was smart, he learned the hardest rule of all: never show fear, because fear was invitation. One winter night, a boy named Alfie, no more than 12, stood before a group of older lads in an alley off Dorset Street. They handed him a knife and pointed to a hanging sack of straw. He cut it once, clean, then twice. The straw fell out like snow. The boys nodded. He'd passed. That was how the alley gave its approval, through silence, not applause. Alfie smiled, because now he belonged. The fog swallowed him after that. By morning, the sun rose over soot and smoke, and London pretended to be civilized again. But beneath the chimneys and the clatter of carriages, the code remained pulsing like a heartbeat under the city's skin. The alleys didn't need parchment or crown to rule. They had memory, fear, and loyalty, and for those who lived there, that was enough. They were born into fog, not into families, not into homes, just fog. It crept through the cracks of every tenement, filled the lungs before the first breath of milk ever came. These were London's lost generation, the ones who never knew daylight without soot. The city called them street urchins, the papers called them pests, but in the alleys, they were simply the children of smoke. By day, they drifted through the markets, barefoot and quick, their eyes sharper than any grown man's. They knew which stalls turned a blind eye, which butchers left scraps out back, which carriages slowed enough for a small hand to slip through and snatch a coin. Hunger taught them mathematics. Desperation taught them grace. They learned to run without sound and lie without guilt, not because they wanted to, but because the world gave them no other language. At night, the fog thickened, and the gangs took them in, not out of kindness, but utility. The little ones were useful. They could crawl through windows, squeeze under fences, carry messages faster than any man through the labyrinth of London's lanes. Each gang had its share: the high rip boys, the dockside kings, even the 40 elephants. A child's size made them invisible, and invisibility was the best armor in a city that punished what it could see. There was a girl named Nellie, barely 10, who could open a locked door with a hairpin and a hum. Her fingers were small miracles, and the men who used her skills bought her ribbons when she succeeded, and bruises when she didn't. Another boy, Tom, older but slower, swept the corners of the taverns for dropped coins and secrets. He'd repeat whatever he overheard to the right ears and earn himself a meal. Sometimes those secrets turned into murders. He stopped asking what his words were worth. The police saw the children as shadows, too small to arrest, too many to reform. When they did catch one, the punishment was never mercy. Boys were whipped, girls sent to workhouses that reeked of bleach and sermons. Some escaped, some didn't. Those who returned to the alleys came back colder, quieter, older in the eyes. They knew by then that no savior was coming. But the children of smoke had their own saints, not of churches, but of streets. They worshipped the chimney sweep who never fell, the pickpocket who vanished into fog, the girl who slit a policeman's purse and lived to brag about it. Legends that gave warmth when blankets could not. One bitter December night, a fire broke out near the docks. The gangs fled, shouting, but the children didn't. They ran toward the flames, darting through smoke to grab what they could: bread, coins, scraps of cloth. The fire ate half the street before the engines arrived, but by morning the kids were gone, their pockets full and their faces black with soot. The newspapers called them looters, the alleys called them clever. When dawn came, the fog returned, as always, thick, loyal, protective. It wrapped around the broken rooftops like a parent's arm. From somewhere deep within, laughter echoed thin, wild, defiant. The city might have forgotten their names, but the smoke never did. It carried them, hid them, kept them alive. For in London's heart, beneath all its splendor and sin, the children of smoke were the truest reflection of the city itself, born from fire, fed by darkness, and destined never to disappear. The lantern always came last. You'd hear the boots first, steady, official, too clean for these streets, and then the soft hiss of gaslight breaking through the fog. It wasn't a comfort, it was a warning. When the glow touched brick, every door closed, every voice fell silent. The gangs knew what it meant. The constables were hunting again. The lantern's glow was pale, almost sickly, like the moon reflected in dirty water. It swung from the officer's hand with mechanical rhythm, slicing the fog into trembling layers of light and shadow. To some, it looked like hope, a promise that someone cared enough to walk these streets. To others, it was the glare of an enemy, searching for ghosts that did not wish to be found. Sergeant Bramley was one of those men who carried the light as if it were a burden. He'd walked Whitechapel for 15 years and still hadn't decided whether he was saving souls or wasting steps. He'd seen what the newspapers never printed: the boy, with a knife smaller than his hunger, the woman whose face was hidden not by vanity but bruises, the men who vanished after promising to change. He'd even arrested the same thief 4 times in one winter, each time thinner, quieter, colder. The gangs knew Bramley. They called him Saint Light, not out of respect, but because he never gave up. He'd wade into fights alone, his lantern swinging like a halo. Sometimes it worked: a glare, a barked name, a flash of his truncheon, and the street would scatter. Other times, it didn't. The lantern would fall, the light would die, and Bramley would crawl back to his post with blood on his sleeve. But he always returned. The light always came back. One fog-heavy night, in 1887, he found himself in the warren of Flower and Dean Street, the heart of what even the police called the abyss. His lantern flickered as he passed the lodging houses, each window filled with shadows pretending to sleep. Somewhere, behind him, a whistle echoed, sharp and sudden. Then another, closer, the signal of a gang on the move. He turned, saw nothing but fog. He moved faster, the light shaking. From the corner came laughter, low, confident, too young to belong to anyone harmless. 5 shapes appeared in the mist, each with a grin sharper than the next. "Evening, Saint Light," one of them said. Bramley raised the lantern higher. It lit their faces. Boys, barely 17, eyes glittering with daring and something like pity. They knew he wouldn't run. They knew he'd stand his ground. When he stepped forward, the lantern flame trembled. A knife flashed, not to kill, just to warn. The boys melted away like ghosts, their laughter fading into the night. Bramley stood alone in the silence that followed, his heart beating in time with the flicker of the flame. He knew this routine too well, the dance between order and survival, played out nightly with no victor. By dawn, the lantern was still burning. He set it on his desk, hands shaking from cold and memory. Outside, the city yawned awake, pretending it had slept peacefully. The gangs would rise with it, the markets would open, and the fog would hide everything again. The lantern would go back out that night, as it always did, a fragile promise of control in a city that belonged to no one. And for those who watched from the alleys, its glow was neither mercy nor menace. It was just the truth. London's light was never strong enough to chase away its shadows, only to remind them where to stand. There was a place where every gang's story crossed, not in courtrooms, not in alleyways, but inside a pub that leaned so crookedly it seemed the whole city's weight pressed on its roof. They called it the Angel's End, though no one who entered had wings left to lose. It sat near the docks, tucked between a pawnbroker's and a warehouse that smelled of fish oil and rust. The windows were always fogged, the lamps always dim. Outside, it looked like any other gin house. Inside, it was London's heartbeat, loud, sour, and pulsing with danger. By day, dockhands and rag pickers filled the benches, drinking to forget their wages before they even earned them. But by night, the Angel's End became a parliament of thieves, men from the High Rip Boys, smugglers from Rotherhithe, pickpockets from Seven Dials. Even the women of the 40 Elephants, when the mood struck, all came here. Rivalries paused at the door. For a few hours, the fog thinned and the city's predators shared the same table. Behind the counter stood old Finnegan, a man who'd long since given up, pretending to pour gin instead of poison. His beard was white, his hands steady, his eyes blind to everything except empty glasses. No one remembered when he'd taken over the pub, only that he'd been there since before the gangs had names. They said Finnegan had once been a boxer, and that the scar running across his throat wasn't from shaving. He rarely spoke, but when he did, even the worst of them listened. On a good night, the floorboards trembled with laughter, fists, and music. A cracked piano played by a man with 2 fingers missing. Smoke coiled through the air like lazy ghosts. On a bad night, the piano stopped, and everyone knew to move aside. Business was being settled. Knives were quiet in the Angel's End. Blood was too valuable to spill without purpose. Burke of the High Rip Boys often held court there, his back to the wall, his men forming a semicircle of loyalty around. Deals were struck under that flickering lamp. Where to move goods, who to bribe, who to warn before the next raid. The 40 Elephants sent girls to eavesdrop, not to steal, but to listen. The real currency in the Angel's End wasn't gin or gold. It was information. And yet, amidst the crime, there was a strange sense of law. The first man to draw a blade paid everyone's tab that night, assuming he lived. The last to leave had to lock the door and face the fog alone. Everyone else slipped away before midnight, each taking their secrets with them. One November evening, the pub went silent before the hour struck 12. A constable had been seen nearby. The room froze. Then, slowly, a woman in a green shawl began to laugh. She was one of the 40 Elephants, bold as sin. "If the laws come drinking," she said, "then pour him a glass." The room erupted again. Someone raised a toast to Her Majesty's confusion. The piano started up, and the moment passed, like a held breath released. By dawn, the fog swallowed the Angel's End once more. Finnegan bolted the door, washed the blood off the bar, and whispered something to the empty room, maybe a prayer. maybe a curse. The gangs would return that night, and the night after, and every night until London burned itself clean. But the pub would remain. It always did. The Angel's End, the one place in the city where saints and sinners drank from the same glass, and where every man's sin sounded the same when it hit the floor. The newspapers called it Her Majesty's Peace, a phrase that sounded noble on paper, printed in bold above sketches of policemen shaking hands with factory owners. It was meant to soothe, to convince the empire that London streets were tamed at last. But under the gaslight and the grime, the truth smelled of gin and ash. The Queen's peace never reached the gutters. It lingered in Parliament speeches and polished halls, far from the alleys where real London breathed. In the West End, the carriages rolled smooth and steady, horses' hooves clattering like clockwork. Gentlemen spoke of progress, of order, of the moral duty to civilize their own. They wrote reports about slum clearances and workhouse reforms, confident that their laws could clean what centuries of poverty had carved into stone. But for every shilling spent on charity, 10 more went to the men who broke bones in the dark to keep the poor invisible. Peace, in London, was a product and business was good. South of the river, the fog was thicker. The policemen there still walked 2 by 2, lanterns swinging like pendulums through a world that refused to stand still. They spoke the Queen's name with the same reverence as a prayer, not because they loved her, but because they feared what would happen if her name lost its power. It was the only thing separating their blue coats from the mobs. But even faith phrase. The gangs grew smarter. The high-rip boys learned the patrol schedules by heart. The Mohawks bribed clerks to erase their names from court ledgers. The 40 Elephants had spies in tailor shops and pawn offices, reporting which detectives wore what. Every law born in Parliament became a game. Every crackdown, a challenge. Constable Bramley, Saint Light, to the alleys, saw it clearer than most. He'd been at a rally once, banners raised, children waving flags, the crowd cheering as a speaker promised to bring the Queen's peace to the streets. That night, he arrested a 12-year-old girl for stealing bread. She'd smiled at him, a small, tired thing, and said, "Is this it, then? The Queen's peace?" He hadn't answered. The question still haunted his sleep. In Clerkenwell, the magistrates' courts overflowed. The cells beneath them stank of wet straw and regret. Every morning, a procession of faces passed before the bench: thieves, drunkards, pickpockets, beggars, all sentenced in the name of the Queen. Each name struck from the roll was replaced by another before sundown. London was too big to be saved by oaths and uniforms. The city's peace, when it came, was strange and quiet. Streets emptied not from safety, but from exhaustion. Shopkeepers closed early. Mothers barred their doors. Even the gangs fell silent sometimes, listening to the distant hum of the industrial heart that fed them all. The Queen's peace wasn't the absence of violence, it was the pause between blows. When night fell, the fog returned, curling through gaslight like a ribbon of memory. Somewhere far away, the clock at Westminster chimed. Its sound reached even here, muffled by the grime, touching every roof and gutter with a kind of indifferent grace. And for one brief moment, the city did grow still, as if pretending to believe the illusion written in its papers. But peace in Victorian London was never built on mercy. It was built on fear, and fear was faithful. By morning, the headlines would speak again of reform, of order, of progress. And in the alleys below, another boy would learn how to use his knife. The Queen's peace, like her empire, depended on both. The first thing you noticed was the smell. It hit before the sight of blood or the sound of blades, that thick, metallic sweetness that clung to your throat like syrup. Butcher's Alley had earned its name honestly. Even in daylight, the place looked half alive, slick with refuse and red rain. By night, the difference between the slaughterhouse and the street was little more than the thickness of a wall. It sat behind Whitechapel Road, tucked between a tannery and an abattoir, where the drains always ran dark and the cats grew fat. Most Londoners avoided it altogether, claiming the fog never lifted there, only changed colour. But to the gangs, Butcher's Alley was sacred ground. It was neutral, or as close as London came to the idea. No one ruled it, and no one truly survived it. Those who walked its length did so on business. By the 1880s, every major gang had a claim to some part of the city: the High Rip Boys, the Docks, the Mohawks, the theatre districts, the 40 Elephants, the shops. But the alley was where they settled debts. Fights that began in taverns or at markets often ended here, beneath the faint glow of a single gas lamp whose flame never seemed steady. The bricks still bore scars of old quarrels, a chip where a knife hit stone, a smear of something too dark to be paint. The man who watched over it was known only as Tallow. He'd once been a butcher himself, until a fight over a debt left him with a missing thumb and a distaste for animals smaller than men. Now he ran his trade from the other side of the counter. If two gangs had a quarrel, they came to him. He arranged the meeting, held the lantern, counted the blows. They called it settling under the cleaver. No weapons longer than a forearm, no interruptions, and no witnesses except Tallow. The law never interfered. Even policemen avoided the alley after dusk. One November night, a dispute brought the High Rip Boys and the Dockside Kings face to face there. It began with words, always the most dangerous weapon in London, and ended with a sound like meat meeting marble. Tallow said nothing, only stepped forward when the last man fell. He raised his lantern, checked the pulse, and nodded once. "Debts paid," he murmured, voice soft enough to sound like a prayer. Then he doused the flame. By morning, the street was quiet again. The fog covered everything, kind as ever. A constable passing by later would notice the blood in the gutter and assume it came from the slaughterhouse. It was easier that way. London thrived on ignorance, a kind of peace that smelled faintly of iron. Butcher's Alley never made the newspapers. It didn't need to. Its legend travelled by word of mouth, spoken low in pubs when the lamps burned down. Every thief, every pickpocket, every bruiser knew the rule. If you found yourself there at night, you weren't walking out whole. It wasn't cruelty that ruled the alley. It was fairness, of a kind Tallow saw to that. When the fog finally lifted, the light touched the alley like a hesitant hand. The stains glowed faintly red beneath it. London moved on, as it always did, too vast and weary to remember where its justice really lived, in places like Butcher's Alley, where law was written in blood and mercy was measured by the minute. At the edge of London, where the river widened into a grey mouth and ships lay stacked like skeletons, the Dockside Kings ruled without crowns. The Thames was their kingdom, dirty, endless, alive, and everything that floated on it belonged to them, even the fog. By day, the docks looked honest. Men hauled crates, shouted orders, sweated for pennies. But when night came, the water turned black and the sound changed. Chains rattled where no cargo moved. Oars dipped without rhythm, and between the warehouses, where lamps were few and watchmen fewer, shadows traded things that could not be listed on any manifest: rum, opium, guns, flesh. The Dockside Kings oversaw it all. Their leader, Samuel Salt Doran, had grown up on the river, a lighterman's son who learned to swim before he learned to speak. His hands were scarred from ropes, his face from fights, and his eyes had the calm of deep water, beautiful until they drowned you. He ran his crew with quiet precision. No shouting, no waste. Every coin counted, every death accounted for. In a city of chaos, Salt's docks ran like clockwork. The police knew him but never caught him. He paid the right men, threatened the wrong ones, and kept his violence tidy. When a rival tried to undercut his prices by smuggling whiskey through Rotherhithe, Salt invited him to a parley on a barge moored midstream. The man went aboard and never came off. The barge drifted for days, empty except for the scent of rum and a single glove nailed to the mast, Salt's quiet signature. The Dockside Kings were different from the street gangs that terrorized the markets. They thought bigger. They weren't content with pockets or taverns. They wanted the arteries of London itself, the goods, the ports, the lifeblood of the empire. Crates marked for Bombay, New York, or Cape Town often passed through their hands first, opened and closed again with invisible care. A missing bottle here, a vanished pistol there, no one noticed until it was too late. Still, they weren't monsters. They were businessmen shaped by hunger. The men under Salt's command worked like laborers and fought like soldiers. They believed the river owed them a living, and they took it without apology. The dock police called them thieves. Salt called them survivors. "The city feeds us and forgets us," he once said. "We just remember to eat." Every few months, a ship would sink near the mouth of the Thames, an accident, the reports claimed. But those who knew better said it was Salt's doing, a warning to captains who refused his tithe. No one dared ask too many questions. The river, like Salt, kept its secrets. One fog-drenched morning, long after the high rip boys had started turning on each other, Salt stood at the pier and watched the water slide beneath him. A boy approached thin, barefoot, carrying a message from the 40 elephants. They wanted to discuss distribution. Salt smiled faintly. The Turs, gangs of land and sea, were learning to trade. The city, for once, was cooperating with itself in crime, if not in peace. By dusk, the barges moved again, gliding through the grey like ghosts. Somewhere out there, beneath the bridges, a song began low, steady, and grim. A river shanty turned into a hymn for those who stole their bread one crate at a time. The dockside kings didn't need newspapers or names. Their stories floated, unrecorded, in the same water that carried London's filth and fortune alike. And when the tide turned, as it always did, the city forgot them again until another body washed up with river mud in its lungs, and people whispered, "The kings are moving." The feud began, as all London wars did, over something small, a coin, a slight, a look that lingered too long. It might have died there, in the shadow of a gin house, if pride hadn't stepped in. But pride was the city's true master. It didn't take long for a single street argument to bloom into years of blood. Bethnal Green was different from Whitechapel or Spitalfields. It had its own rhythm, its own code, tighter, meaner, more family than gang. The people there didn't just live close. They were born tangled, their grudges passed down like heirlooms. When the trouble started between the Hanleys and the Crows, it wasn't two men fighting. It was two bloodlines. The Hanleys were bricklayers by trade, known for hard fists and harder tempers. The Crows ran carriages and horses, loud, proud, always smelling of sweat and hay. They shared the same streets, the same taverns, the same churchyard. For a while, they even shared friendships. But one summer night, in 1884, that changed. The story went that Thomas Hanley, the eldest son, caught William Crowe cheating at cards in the Black Bishop Tavern. Words were exchanged, chairs overturned, and a knife appeared. William stumbled into the street, with his throat cut, bleeding into the gutter, beneath a flickering lamp. He lived for 2 days, long enough to name his killer. From that night on, Bethnal Green split in two. Every alley had a side, every market stall a loyalty. Children learned the names of their enemies before their prayers. A Hanley couldn't cross to the east side without a rock thrown, and a Crow boy who wandered west never came back unmarked. The police tried, briefly, to intervene. They arrested Thomas Hanley, but the witnesses vanished into the fog, and the charges fell apart. A constable named Garrick later said the trial was like watching two wolves argue over which had cleaner teeth. The law couldn't touch them. So the feud continued, quiet but constant, a dozen small cuts, building towards something larger. By winter, the alleys became war zones. Shops burned, men vanished, horses were found gutted in the street, their owners' initials carved into nearby doors. The women held funerals without bodies. The 40 elephants stopped passing through altogether, saying the air smelled of iron and ghosts. On Christmas Eve of 1885, the feud reached its peak. The Crows set fire to a Hanley-owned warehouse near the canal. Flames climbed the night like a beacon. painting the fog red. The Hanleys retaliated before the embers cooled, storming the Crows' stables with bottles and blades. No one remembered who swung first, but by morning, 6 men were dead, and the constables refused to enter the district for a week. In the months that followed, both families began to fade. The older men died, the younger ones fled or hanged. The streets grew quiet again, but not peaceful. Every brick in Bethnal Green seemed to remember. Years later, when new gangs came, they still whispered the names Hanley and Crow, with something like reverence the families who'd taught London that vengeance could outlive the men who sought it. By then, the feud had no winners, only echoes. The taverns rebuilt, the canal darkened again, and the fog returned, patient as ever. But some nights, when the wind passes through Bethnal Green just right, the locals swear they can hear it, boots running, bottles shattering, voices shouting in the old war's rhythm. The blood may have dried, but the city never forgets the sound. The razor men arrived with the change in fashion. By the late 1880s, London's underworld had traded cudgels for cunning and steel. Fists broke bones, but razors left messages. A man with a scar was a walking signature, marked forever by whoever ruled his street. To the razor men, blood wasn't waste. It was advertisement. No one knew who started it. Some blamed sailors returning from New York, where street fights had long involved blades tucked in hats and boots. Others swore it began in the barber shops, men tired of scraping faces for pennies, learning how sharp a living could be. However it started, by 1887 the habit had spread like smoke. Folding razors slipped easily into sleeves, and a flick of the wrist could open anything: flesh, purse, or promise. They weren't one gang, but many. The razor men were a movement: boys from Limehouse, dockhands from Bermondsey, gamblers from Soho. Each group had its own corner and its own mark. Some carved initials into doors, others into men. The sound of a blade snapping open became the anthem of the slums, as familiar as church bells, and twice as holy. Among them, one name rose higher than the rest: Jacob Finch, called Gentle Jack. He was 23, handsome, soft-spoken, and so neat he could have passed for a clerk. His coat was always pressed, his hat spotless, his blade clean. He believed a man's reputation should be as polished as his weapon. Under his command, the razor men became something closer to an army. They had uniforms of a sort: dark coats, red scarves, and they patrolled their turf with a soldier's precision. Jack's rule was simple: no noise, no waste, no mercy. The first man to shout before striking was punished. The first to kill without reason was buried where the tide could reach him. His justice was brutal but balanced, and London, strange city that it was, respected that. Even the police learned to look away when the red scarves appeared. Their greatest enemy was time. The fog grew thicker, the law stricter, the newspapers hungrier for sensation. Each week brought new stories of razor riots, though half of them were written by men who'd never set foot east of Aldgate. But the violence was real enough. Women left home with scarves wrapped high, afraid of crossing paths with the wrong smile. Children played games in imitation, drawing imaginary blades across their cheeks. It became part of the rhythm of life, the threat always waiting in the mist. One autumn night, Gentle Jack vanished. Some said he'd been betrayed by his own second-in-command, others that he'd retired to France under a new name. His red scarf was found tied to a lamppost in Whitechapel, fluttering like a flag. Without him, the razor men fractured smaller crews fighting over the scraps of his empire. But his code remained. Decades later, old men in gin houses would still touch the thin scars that traced their jaws and mutter, "Jack taught us respect." To them, he was less a man than a lesson that civility and cruelty could share the same face, that silence could be sharper than steel. When the fog returned to swallow London each night, the gaslight glinted on unseen metal, and somewhere deep within that darkness, a razor whispered open, quick, clean, and certain, reminding the city that peace had never been its natural state. Only pause, only breath. Only the edge waiting beneath the coat. They arrived dressed for dinner, tailcoats, polished boots, gloves so white they caught the gaslight like teeth. The city called them gentlemen, and that suited them just fine. Respectability was the sharpest disguise a man could wear. In drawing rooms and billiard halls, they spoke the language of the upper crust, but after midnight, they spoke the language of locks. The gentlemen thieves were not born rich. They were made rich by imitation. They studied their betters the way pickpockets studied drunks, observing every gesture, every vanity, every flaw that could be exploited. Some had once been servants, dismissed for theft or insolence. Others were sons of bankrupt tradesmen who'd learned that charm opened more doors than keys. Together, they crafted a new kind of crime, elegant, invisible, and always dressed in silk. Their leader was a man who called himself Mr. Armitage. No one knew his first name, or whether it had ever been his at all. He moved between the classes like smoke, perfectly at ease among dukes and beggars alike. He kept a silver pocket watch that never told the right time, a private joke perhaps, or a reminder that he alone chose when things began and ended. Under his command, the gentlemen thieves operated with precision. Their targets weren't warehouses or pawnbrokers, but London's finest homes, houses lined with velvet and arrogance. Invitations were forged, servants bribed, and before dawn the jewels of Mayfair vanished as gracefully as a sigh. No broken windows, no alarms, just empty velvet cases, and the faint scent of tobacco where the thief had lingered too long. They treated each heist as theatre. Every role rehearsed, every cue practiced. One might arrive as a visiting cousin from the colonies, another as a physician called to an ailing aunt. While the household slept, they would meet in the study, pocket the silver, and leave calling cards, handwritten notes that read, "Thank you for the evening." It was audacity disguised as etiquette, and London adored it. The newspapers reported their exploits with the same breathless admiration reserved for the royal family. The police were humiliated. Commissioner Warren himself declared that a new breed of criminal had emerged, one that understood both society and sin. But by the time detectives knocked at the doors of tailors and watchmakers, the gentlemen thieves were already somewhere else at the opera, perhaps, or laughing in a private box, clapping for the overture of a story they'd written themselves. One night, though, the game soured. During a raid on a banker's house in Kensington, the youngest of them, a boy named Ezra, fell through a glass skylight and shattered both legs. Armitage carried him out alone, silent and composed, blood staining his cuffs. Ezra lived, but the fall cracked something in the group. The laughter went hollow. The next job was cancelled. Within months, they scattered. Some fled abroad, others disappeared into respectability, marrying the daughters of men they'd robbed. London's appetite for romance forgave them. The tales of the gentlemen thieves became legend, the criminals too well-mannered to hate. Plays were written, songs composed. The public loved the idea of sin dressed in charm. They never asked what happened to Mr. Armitage, though some swore he retired as a butler in a lord's house, serving tea with the same hand that once picked locks. By the turn of the century, their legacy was everywhere, in the tailored coats of new gangs, in the etiquette of deception that made crime feel refined. The streets learned what the salons had always known. Appearances were everything. A knife could terrify, but a smile could ruin a kingdom. And so, beneath London's marble and manners, another kind of thief survived, one who didn't steal with force, but with grace. The city never stopped admiring him for it. The night began like any other, the usual fog pressing low, the streets humming faintly with carts and laughter. Then, sometime after 10, the lamps went out. Not all at once, but in waves, flickers turning to darkness. One district after another swallowed whole. It started near Limehouse, rippled through Whitechapel, and by midnight, half of London lay blind. The papers would later call it the Great Outage, blaming faulty mains and damp air. But those who lived through it never believed that story. The timing was too perfect, too precise. Some whispered it was sabotage, a gang's revenge on the constables, or an experiment gone wrong in the underbelly of the city. Others said London itself had finally blinked, tired of watching so much sin. Whatever the truth, when the gaslights died, the city changed. The darkness wasn't just absence, it was alive, thick and humming. The fog became a wall, sound travelled strange, and even the bravest men walked slower. The gangs loved it. For once, the night belonged entirely to them. At the Angel's End pub, Burke of the High Rip Boys raised his glass to the blackout. "Now we're all kings," he said, his grin a white slash in the dark. And he was right. Without light, the constables were powerless. Whistles blew, truncheons waved, but no one could see enough to run or fight. The rules dissolved with the glow. In Whitechapel, a pack of razor men tested their blades on the wooden posts of dead lamps, carving initials into the city's bones. Across the river, the dockside kings looted warehouses by torchlight, their silhouettes flickering like demons on the walls. Even the 40 elephants came out that night, their skirts heavy with stolen silk. The whole city pulsed like a heartbeat, fast and fearful. But the darkness cut both ways. When the lights failed, so did direction, order, reason. Friends mistook friends for foes. Fires started from overturned lanterns. Horses panicked, carriages overturned. The Thames, invisible and silent, swallowed more men in those few hours than in any storm that decade. And through it all, London kept breathing, wheezing, gasping, whispering to itself in the dark. Near Bethnal Green, an old constable named Garrick lit his last match and held it high. The flame trembled, showing faces around him pale, wide-eyed, hungry, children clutching one another, mothers whispering prayers. He'd spent his life believing light meant safety, but in that moment, he saw the truth. Light only ever hid what the city really was. The dark didn't create danger, it revealed it. Just before dawn, the gas returned. One by one, the lamps shuddered awake, sputtering like souls dragged back from the grave. The streets looked the same, but nothing felt right. People spoke softly that morning, as though afraid to wake something that hadn't gone back to sleep. The gangs told stories for years about that night, how the city finally belonged to them, how they ruled by instinct alone. But others remembered it differently. They remembered the silence, the screams, the way their hearts beat too loud. They remembered learning how fragile light really was. When the lamps burned steady again, London pretended to move on. But every flicker afterward made people glance over their shoulders. The darkness had left its mark. Somewhere behind the flame, the city's shadow waited, patient and smiling, knowing it would have its turn again. Her name was Nora, though most of London only knew her by the title she earned, the Orphan Queen. She was born in a workhouse and raised by the streets, a child of soot and silence, who learned early that pity was just another kind of hunger. By the age of 12, she could pick a lock faster than a constable could draw his whistle. By 16, she commanded boys twice her size. And by 20, every alley from Aldgate to Limehouse bowed to her name. It began, as power often does, in desperation. The High Rip Boys had grown careless, the dockside kings too rich to notice their youngest runners starving. Nora gathered those the city forgot: chimney sweeps, beggar girls, shoeless boys who slept beneath bridges, and gave them rules. Not kindness, not comfort, but rules. You eat because you work, she told them. You live because you listen. They did both. Within a year, her crew, the mourners, they called themselves, ran the narrow arteries of the East End with precision. They wore grey scarves tied at the throat, the colour of fog and funerals. Their crimes were clever, quiet: stolen letters, intercepted parcels, secret messages sold to men who paid well to know what their rivals whispered. Nora understood information was worth more than gold. Where other gangs traded blows, she traded secrets. Her network spread through the city like smoke under a door. She never shouted, her voice was low, her manner calm. Those who met her said she looked like she was always listening not to you, but to something larger, humming behind the noise. The other gangs dismissed her at first, then they noticed her reach. A deal at the docks went wrong, and somehow she already knew. A shipment disappeared from a warehouse, and she had the manifest in her hand by morning. The 40 elephants themselves began sending word before their raids, asking the orphan queen which routes were safest. Her power wasn't built on fear, but on debt. Every child she saved owed her something, a favor, a silence, a future. And she collected. She fed them, taught them, kept them alive through the winters when the Thames froze and the rich threw feasts behind glass. But she never pretended to be their mother. Queens don't love, she told one boy who asked if she did. They remember. In the summer of 1889, when the city boiled with heat and tension, the police raided the East End in a sweep meant to break the gangs for good. Hundreds were dragged into wagons, but not a single one of Nora's mourners was found. They had vanished into cellars and rooftops, guided by messages no constable could decipher. Some said she had an informant in Scotland Yard. Others believed she had memorized the city's veins so completely that London itself hid her. The raids ended, and life went on. The other gangs rebuilt, scarred but standing. Only the orphan queen faded, quietly, the way mist does when morning comes. Some claimed she sailed for America under another name. Others swore she still walked the riverbanks at night, her grey scarf fluttering like a warning to those who thought power was the same as cruelty. But those who truly knew her whispered a different ending, that Nora never left, only blended into the fog that raised her, that even now, when the lamps burn low and the air tastes of rain and iron, a voice can be heard from somewhere deep within the alleys, soft, certain, patient, reminding the city she once ruled, queens don't love, they endure. And so she does, her crown made of smoke, her empire of silence, the last sovereign of London's underworld. He'd walked the same beat for 20 years from Shoreditch High Street to the bend at Whitechapel Road, through the same fog, past the same faces that changed only in age and scars. Constable Henry Pritchard, a man built like an oak trunk, steady, slow, with eyes that had seen too much and understood too little. The gangs called him the Shadow, not because he was invisible, but because he always arrived 1 minute too late after the fight, after the scream, after the blood had already dried. In the early years, he believed in the job. He carried his lantern with pride, polished his badge until it gleamed like virtue itself. He told himself that London could be saved, that the law was stronger than hunger, that decency would outlast fear. But London, as ever, had other lessons to teach. The first child he pulled from the river was 8 years old, a boy from Limehouse with soot under his fingernails. The sight of him didn't make Pritchard stronger, it made him slower. He began to move through the streets like a man carrying ghosts. By 1888, the city had stopped pretending. The Whitechapel murders had stripped the fog of its mystery, leaving only horror. The gangs used the chaos to tighten their grip. The high rip boys taxed shopkeepers for safety. The razor men ruled the taverns, and Pritchard, now grey at the temples, found himself alone in a war no one declared. The other constables laughed at him, said he was chasing shadows, talking to ghosts. They didn't see what he saw. The quiet deals made behind shuttered doors, the boys who vanished 1 week and reappeared the next with money and blood on their hands. He kept a notebook, small and battered, hidden inside his coat. Each night he wrote names, not criminals, but victims. A baker who refused to pay protection, a seamstress caught smuggling goods for the 40 elephants, a messenger boy with his throat cut in Clerkenwell. There were too many names for one man to avenge, too many dead for one notebook to hold. But still he wrote, as though recording the city's sins might one day weigh it down enough to stop. One night in November, Pritchard followed a rumour into Butcher's Alley. The fog was thick, heavy with the smell of tallow and rain. He carried no lantern this time, the light made him a target. He heard movement ahead, whispers, a scrape of metal, the sound of a match being struck. Then a voice, female, calm, precise. "You shouldn't be here, Constable." It was the orphan queen, or so the legend would later claim. What passed between them no one knows. Some said she offered him a place in her shadow network. Others claimed she warned him to stop hunting what could not be caught. But when dawn came, Pritchard returned to his post, eyes hollow, notebook gone. He never spoke of that night again. Years later, after his death, a new constable found a box in the station's storeroom. Inside lay a badge, dulled with age, and a single page, torn from that notebook, no names. Only a line written in an unsteady hand. "The city doesn't fear the dark, it fears what I see when the light returns." And so Henry Pritchard's ghost joined the others, walking the same path beneath the same flickering lamps, another weary guardian watching a city that never wanted saving. His lantern may have gone out, but his shadow never left London. It still lingers where the law meets the fog, waiting for the next man foolish enough to believe the streets can change. London had grown quieter that year, not peaceful, just quiet in the way a knife stills before it cuts. The gangs had learned that noise drew the constables, and constables drew questions, and questions were expensive. Silence, on the other hand, was profitable. You could sell it, trade it, even kill for it. The city's new currency wasn't gold or gin or fear. It was silence. It began in Spitalfields. A shopkeeper named Miriam Levin refused to pay protection to the High Rip boys, thinking their power had waned since Burke's disappearance. The next morning, her windows were intact, her goods untouched, her till unbroken. But no one spoke to her again. Not a customer, not a neighbor, not even her friends from synagogue. The silence smothered her worse than any violence could have. Within a month, she closed her shop and left the city. That was how the message spread. Sometimes, the absence of a word could wound deeper than any blade. The gangs learned to wield that absence like art. The razormen stopped marking their victims. The dockside kings ceased their songs. The 40 elephants worked their heists without so much as the sound of a heel clicking. Even the pubs fell quiet after midnight, as if every drinker had been sworn to secrecy by some invisible oath. London turned inward. Conversations ended when footsteps passed by. People learned to read mouths instead of voices. The fog itself seemed to muffle more than sound, it erased consequence. For the constables, it was worse than open war. Witnesses vanished into silence. Informants stopped showing up. Even bribes failed to loosen tongues. The law depends on words, on confessions, on testimony, on accusation, and those had all gone missing. One magistrate described the East End as a city underwater, where sound cannot travel. But someone profited. In the rooms above the Angel's End, a man named Francis Keene built an empire from other people's quiet. A failed journalist turned broker, he sold secrets like stock. For a price, he could make a story disappear, a scandal hushed, a trial forgotten, a murder's name lost to the fog. His clients ranged from dock gangs to politicians, each eager to buy a piece of the city's silence. He kept ledgers filled with names, though no one ever saw them twice. Some said he burned each page after reading. Others whispered that he buried them somewhere along the Thames, weighted with coins. The silence grew contagious. Lovers stopped quarreling for fear of being overheard. Landlords collected rent without speaking a word. Even the churches began to empty. Prayers felt useless in a city where God seemed to have closed his ears. At night, the streets were so still you could hear the ticking of unseen clocks, marking time for men who no longer dared to speak it aloud. Then, one morning, Keene was found slumped over his desk, a quill still in his hand, his throat cut from ear to ear. The room was untouched, no struggle, no theft, not even a spilled inkpot. Only a single line written across the open ledger: "Even silence has a master." The police called it suicide, though the knife was never found. After his death, the quiet deepened further, as if the city itself were in mourning or obedience. For weeks, even the birds seemed mute. No one spoke his name. not even in jest. And then, slowly, London began to hum again. Footsteps, whispers, wheels, and the distant toll of a bell. But beneath it all, something lingered, an understanding too dangerous to voice. That silence still lives under the noise of the city, waiting to be bought, waiting to be broken. And when the fog falls thick over the Thames and the lamps dim to a glow, London listens to itself again, to what isn't said, to what can't be said, and remembers the winter when words themselves cost too much to afford. The city smelled of smoke and burnt sugar that winter, not from hearths, but from whiskey barrels smashed, staves broken, liquor running into gutters like blood. London had learned to measure war in coins and bodies, but the whiskey wars were different. They weren't about territory or respect. They were about control of the flow, the barrels that fed the city's hunger, the spirits that fueled every crime. It began in Bermondsey, at a dock where the night air always tasted of salt and rot. Two gangs, the dockside kings and a new crew calling themselves the Black Sashes, argued over the unloading of a shipment from Scotland. Words escalated, fists followed, and by midnight, the first barrels were shattered. The river caught some, the streets caught the rest. By dawn, the smell of burnt sugar and sour gin drifted across the East End. The dockside kings, led by Samuel Salt Doran, took the blow as a challenge. Their men moved with silent precision, intercepting every shipment that didn't bear their mark. The Black Sashes retaliated by torching warehouses, scattering casks into the streets and alleys. The city watched with a mixture of fear and fascination, fires reflected in the Thames, children peering from windows, constables turning their heads. By the second week, London's pubs became battlefields. Barrels were smashed in doorways to send messages. Floors slicked with spilled whiskey made every step dangerous. Shopkeepers barricaded doors, waiting for someone to pay tribute or be replaced. The 40 elephants saw opportunity in chaos, intercepting deliveries meant for either gang, lifting silk and coins alike. Even the Mohawks emerged from their corners, drawn by the thrill, carving their initials into barrels as if to claim what remained. The fights were quiet but brutal. Knives flashed under lamplight, fists broke teeth and jaws, and sometimes a stray bullet from a pistol fired in panic would find an unintended mark. Yet no one called the police. London had learned that law always arrived too late, its blue coats swallowed by fog or fear. The whiskey wars were private, and the city respected privacy in its own strange way. Salt, the dockside king, moved with calculation. He had men watching every landing, every canal, every cart that came near Bermondsey. No cask could leave without his approval. The Black Sashes, smaller but faster, tried diversions, fires along the banks, fake shipments, bribes to dock workers. Each strategy escalated the tension. Every night became a test. Whose control was faster, stronger, deadlier? The violence extended beyond the docks. Taverns along the Thames reported fights breaking out over spilled whiskey. Women and children caught in the wrong pub had to pay tribute with coins or silence, or risk the ire of men too drunk to reason but too clever to miss opportunity. Rumors spread of entire shipments vanishing overnight, only to reappear later with another gang's marker, signature in soot or chalk, sometimes even a blood smear. By Christmas, the whiskey wars had drawn in nearly every gang in the East End. Spitalfields, Whitechapel, and Limehouse became a network of hidden battlefields. And yet, amidst the chaos, one thing remained certain. Whoever controlled the whiskey controlled the city. Money, influence, and fear were all distilled into those barrels. When the fog finally lifted and the fires burned out, London smelled of smoke, sugar, and iron. The Black Sashes had lost their footing. The dockside kings claimed victory for now, but everyone knew the next shipment, the next night, could undo it all. In London, power flowed like whiskey, golden, volatile, and capable of killing anyone who underestimated its reach. And somewhere beneath the glow of the gas lamps, the city waited, silent and patient, for the next war to pour itself into the alleys and docks again. By the time morphine and laudanum began to appear in the East End, London's underworld had already mastered a different sort of pain. The razor men sharpened their blades, the dockside kings hoarded their casks, and the 40 elephants stole the silver that paid for both. But now, a new weapon arrived, one that worked from the inside, a chemical that promised mercy and threatened obedience, flowing into veins and bending minds. The city called it medicine, the gangs called it opportunity. Boys who had once swung knives for a loaf of bread now sold whispers in exchange for a small bottle. The women of the 40 elephants mixed it into gin for the wealthier thieves, and even the Mohawks experimented with it on themselves, a reward after a fight, a lull before a heist. The needle became another tool, like the knife or the lockpick, precise, silent, deadly. It started with minor use. A man's hand throbbed from a beating, a drop of laudanum relieved the pain, a dock worker's back protested from hauling barrels. Morphine quieted the scream long enough to finish the job, but the gangs understood instinctively that relief could be traded. A boy would carry a dose in a matchbox, offering it to someone who owed him a favor, or demanding silence in return. One injection, one moment of forgetfulness, and debts could be collected without a sound. The alleyways became laboratories, makeshift and crude. Candles flickered over, tables crowded with syringes, tiny bottles, and scraps of cloth. Boys and girls learned to mix, measure, and administer with the same care they gave to a blade. It was art in its own brutal sense. One wrong drop could kill, one too little could fail. Mistakes were written on faces, in pale skin and trembling hands, and recorded in whispers for lessons learned. Burke of the High Rip Boys was an early adopter. He had always believed in fear as currency, but now he could trade pain for obedience directly. A man refusing tribute might awaken with a white powder in his vein, compliant, weak, and grateful. The razor men experimented with using morphine to calm adversaries, before a strike easier to carve initials into a body that could barely resist than one thrashing and cursing. It became a new rhythm of violence, one that the city would never forgive. But nothing comes without cost. Addiction spread as quickly as respect. Boys who once ran with knives now craved needles. Girls who carried silk pockets full of stolen silver now carried bottles of opium. One child overdosed in the corner of an abandoned warehouse, and the others watched silently, learning the most important rule. The drug obeyed no one. Even the strongest gangs fell under its spell. By 1889, the East End was divided not only by loyalty or territory, but by access to the needle. Those with supply wielded power, those without lived in fear, constantly bargaining for another drop. Even the police, frustrated and unknowing, could only arrest bodies, already hollowed by their own desperation. London's fog now carried the scent of alcohol, coal smoke, and something sweeter, a chemical promise that no one could resist. Some nights, when the lamps flickered low and the fog pressed against every brick, you could see it in the alleys. A boy, thin as a rail, syringe in hand, waiting for the next debtor, the next mark, the next slave to the quiet violence that flowed through his veins. The knife still cut, the fist still bruised, but the needle whispered faster, quieter, deadlier. London had discovered a new edge, one that ran beneath the skin, and through the city's soul a lesson in obedience more absolute than any fear, and a reminder that in the East End, the line between mercy and murder had always been as thin as a blade. It started with smoke, thin at first, curling lazily from a warehouse near the fish market, blending with the familiar stench of brine and coal. By the time anyone noticed, it had grown thick and heavy, burning orange against the fog like a wound in the city. London held its breath. Fires were never accidental here. They were announcements. The warehouse belonged to a merchant who dealt in rum and imported goods. He'd refused to pay tribute to the dockside kings that month, claiming that protection was his right and loyalty optional. It was the kind of arrogance that invited consequences. By midnight, the front doors had been barricaded, and flames licked the roof, sending sparks high into the fog. From nearby alleys, the gangs watched with satisfaction, their city performing for them like a stage. The high-rip boys moved first. They arrived silently, cloaked in smoke and night, guiding frightened dockhands away from the blaze while salvaging what they could carry. The fire wasn't meant to kill, at least, not yet, but to send a message. Every barrel of rum, every crate of cloth, every ledger tossed into the flames was a warning to anyone who doubted their reach. Meanwhile, the 40 elephants circled from the opposite side. Women in skirts, weighed down by hidden pouches of silver, slipped into back doors and windows, retrieving valuables before the fire claimed them. Their movements were precise, almost elegant, in stark contrast to the chaos. Where men relied on fists and knives, they relied on instinct and cunning. By the time the flames reached the center of the warehouse, their haul was already secure. Even the razor men appeared, blades glinting as they cut through ropes and broken beams, creating safe passages for the gangs to maneuver. Fights broke out occasionally over claims: a crate too heavy, a bag of coins too tempting, but Tallow, the old overseer of Butcher's Alley, appeared from the shadows to settle disputes. "The fire is bigger than your quarrel," he said, voice low and measured. And just like that, the skirmishes ended, the smoke swallowing both blood and anger alike. The constables arrived long after the flames had grown unmanageable. By the time their hoses hissed and their boots sank into charred debris, London had already moved on. Witnesses were reluctant to speak. Dockhands muttered apologies. Merchants complained quietly. And the children of the alleys had already begun scavenging from the smouldering remains. The fire, like so many other nights in the East End, had been both spectacle and schoolroom lessons delivered in smoke, fear, and ash. By morning, the warehouse was a ruin. The smell of burnt rum and fish lingered in the alleys, sticking to coats and collars. Newsmen printed sensational accounts: warehouse engulfed, men and women brave flames. Yet the truth remained obscured. It wasn't bravery that had saved the day, nor were the fires accidents of chance. The gangs had orchestrated every movement, every rescue, every stolen coin. London's criminal hierarchy had been reinforced under a sky of orange haze and choking smoke. Even in the aftermath, the lesson was clear. Property could burn, reputation could rise, and the city itself, soaked in fog and soot, had learned once more that fire, like the gangs who commanded it, was never just destruction. It was a reminder that power flowed through the streets in more ways than one, and that survival in London was measured not by law or order, but by cunning, speed, and the ability to walk through smoke and remain unscathed. As the sun broke weakly through the fog the next day, the East End smelled of ash, tar, and opportunity. And somewhere in the alleys, boys and girls whispered excitedly about the night the city had burned and the gangs had triumphed again. Quiet victories written in smoke and flame. She was small, no taller than a man's knee, and yet her presence could fill an entire street. Alice Diamond, called the Queen of the 40 Elephants, had been born into the East End's relentless hum of hunger and hardship, and she had learned early that survival demanded cunning sharper than any blade. By the time she was 12, she had mastered the art of theft, not the clumsy snatchings of children, but the elegant, precise maneuvers of a professional. By 20, she commanded the most feared female gang London had ever seen. The 40 Elephants were an anomaly. In a city dominated by fists and blades, they ruled with subtlety and coordination. Their tools were gloves, mirrors, and keen observation, not brute force. They dressed like ladies, even while lifting silverware from the tables of Mayfair or intercepting a shipment at Billingsgate. Alice taught them to blend, to vanish, to strike without leaving a trace. The streets became their stage, and every alleyway a lesson in discretion and audacity. Her leadership was legendary. She organized her gang with the precision of a general. Every member had a role. scouts to map the streets, lookouts to watch for constables, couriers to carry messages, and thieves to execute the work. Nothing was left to chance. Alice's instructions were always calm, clear, and absolute: no questions, no hesitation. The women learned quickly that hesitation meant loss, and loss meant punishment. It was a cruel but effective education. The newspapers tried to capture her in print. They called her the lady gangster, the mistress of crime, and even London's invisible threat. But Alice delighted in the absurdity. The more attention she received, the more invisible she became. She moved in plain sight, collecting riches and intelligence, teaching her girls, and always staying a step ahead of the law. When Scotland Yard attempted to infiltrate her operations, Alice had already anticipated their approach. By the time the officers reached the East End, they found only whispers and empty streets. Despite the ruthlessness, there was method to her cruelty. She ensured the gang's youngest girls were fed and protected, rewarding loyalty and punishing betrayal. Her morality was mercenary: survive, thrive, and serve the collective good of the 40 elephants. She understood that fear could command obedience, but respect commanded devotion. Under her guidance, the gang became more than a collection of thieves. It became a family, a network, a power unto itself. Alice's reign was not without challenges. Rival gangs attempted to encroach on her territory, policemen tried to catch her, and one ambitious boy from the High Rip Boys once sought to challenge her authority. She responded with patience and precision. By dawn, his men had disappeared, his supplies gone, and a single note pinned to the door: "Some crowns are worn invisibly." The lesson was clear. Alice Diamond was untouchable, not because of violence, but because of foresight. By 1890, her empire stretched across the East End. The 40 elephants were feared, respected, and invisible in the same breath. Shops and warehouses, taverns and markets all knew her reach. Yet Alice herself was rarely seen. She preferred shadows, whispering through alleys, leaving only results: coins missing, shipments intercepted, rivals humbled. When the fog rolled in from the Thames at night, Alice Diamond walked it like a queen among her subjects. The city trembled quietly beneath her influence, unaware that its streets were governed by a small woman with a keen mind, sharp instincts, and a heart that beat only for the 40 elephants. London had its kings, its criminals, its chaos, but in the East End there was also a queen, and her reign was absolute. The church bells rang faintly, but no one inside their walls listened. Outside, in the alleys and gutters of the East End, London's children played a different kind of hymn. It was a chorus of survival, sharp as razors, sweet as stolen sugar. Faith and fear intertwined in ways the steeples could not reach. For every sermon preached above, 100 lessons were learned below, in silence, in shadows, in the smell of coal and rain. In these streets, the sacred and the profane shared the same breath. Boys recited prayers while lifting coins from unwary hands. Girls whispered confessions while slipping silks from shop windows. Every child knew instinctively which lessons mattered: where to hide, who to trust, and when to strike. The clergy might call it sin, the constables called it crime, but the city called it life. Survival was holiness in its own right. The 40 elephants, guided by Alice Diamond, moved with reverence beneath this unholy cathedral of streets. The women carried their tools carefully, almost as if laying them upon altars: the stolen silver, the hidden letters, the whispers purchased with a glance or a gesture. Each was a prayer answered, a debt collected, a balance of power maintained. They were saints of the shadows, worshipping in a church no one could enter except by blood and cunning. Even the Mohawks and the Razormen respected the invisible sanctuary of the alleyways. Fights occurred, but only in rhythm, only where no one would be found too soon. Blood could be shed, but lessons could not. Every scar was a scripture, every bruise a sermon. To the children growing up amidst the smoke and fog, The alleys themselves became a confessional, a pulpit, a classroom. Here, the language of knives and whispers was louder than any hymn sung inside the spires. One winter evening, as the fog pressed heavy against the lamplight, a boy named Samuel knelt beside a gutter, counting coins he had filched from a drunken merchant. He muttered a prayer, under his breath, not to a god, but to the streets themselves, to the brick walls, the chimneys, the shadows. A girl named Maggie, barely older than 10, leaned close and whispered, "Amen." They were not innocent, not holy, but in that moment, the city itself seemed to answer. It had claimed them and taught them its own creed. The constables would later record the violence, the thefts, the disappearances. They would write reports, hold hearings, and print warnings in the papers. But they could not understand the faith that bound the children to the streets. The church offered hope, the gutter offered certainty. One was a distant promise, the other a tangible law. And for those who walked beneath the fog and gaslight, certainty was far more reliable than heaven. By dawn, the fog lifted slightly, and London tried to remember itself. But the lessons of the night lingered in the cobbles, in the puddles, in the eyes of the children who had seen more than any sermon could teach. The 40 elephants, the razor men, the Mohawks, and every boy and girl who survived another night bowed, in silence, to the city's unspoken doctrine. The church remained above, its bells tolling hollowly. Beneath, in the gutters, life continued as it always had. Faith had found a companion in fear, and morality had learned to walk with survival. The streets whispered their own gospel, one written not in ink, but in blood, coin, and smoke. London's underworld, in all its brutality and cunning, had created its own liturgy, a creed that even the angels above could not ignore. They came with ink-stained fingers and spectacles slipping down their noses, carrying notebooks and quills as if they were swords. The newspaper men of London were not saints, but they were historians of chaos, scribes of the city's unending wars. While the gangs sharpened knives and polished brass, these men sharpened words, chasing stories that would disappear into print before the fog swallowed them whole. It was 1887, and the East End had become a theatre of shadows. Murders, thefts, and mysterious disappearances were common, but the public could not witness the performance firsthand. That was the newspaper men's gift to witness, record, and embellish, turning the alleyways into headlines and the screams of the city into literature. They moved cautiously, knowing that a wrong glance could earn a knife between ribs or a barrel dropped on their feet. They became ghost hunters in a city of ghosts, chronicling a life London preferred to forget. Most reporters were young, eager, and slightly foolish. They carried lanterns and notebooks, taking careful notes of the gaslit streets and the movements of the gangs, the high rip boys, the razor men, the 40 elephants, the dockside kings. All became recurring characters in their articles. Every theft, every fire, every duel in the fog-fed alleyways was transformed into narrative, given rhythm and drama for readers in drawing rooms far from the stench of coal and sweat. Yet the newspaper men were not merely observers. They became players themselves. They bribed boys for information, listened at doors for whispered secrets, and even arranged clandestine meetings with gang leaders to ensure a story's survival. One reporter, a man named Jonathan Phelps, managed to embed himself with the Mohawks for a month, living in alleys, stealing bread with them, and witnessing acts of brutality that no editor would ever allow to print in full. By the end, he had earned both their respect and a scar across his cheek, a mark of the city's indifference to innocence. The articles that emerged were half truth, half legend. The public read of masked women intercepting cargo, of shadowed figures slipping through tavern doors, of fires raging in warehouses where police dared not enter. The stories painted London as a city of danger, daring, and dark romance. Families in Kensington and Bloomsbury discussed these events over breakfast, oblivious to the reality of blood and hunger just a few miles away. The newspapers sold fear as easily as they sold sugar, and the East End became famous for its audacity, cruelty, and cunning long before tourists ever set foot in its alleys. But the cost for the scribes was high. Some disappeared, dragged into fog-filled lanes for knowing too much. Others returned home at night, haunted by the faces they had recorded, whispering their secrets to ink and paper. Their pens became weapons, their words currency. Every headline had power, every omission had consequences. A misprinted name could lead to death, and a forgotten detail could mean the loss of a story or a life. By midnight, the city hummed with stories waiting to be written. The alleys whispered, the lamps flickered, and the fog pressed heavy against the shutters of pubs and shops. The newspapermen moved through it all, silent and careful, knowing that their survival depended on observing without interfering, recording without revealing, and understanding that the city's pulse was faster and deadlier than any human hand could measure. When dawn broke, London read its own legend, the newspapers spreading the tales of gangs, fires, thefts, and whispered murders to a world that could not smell the smoke, see the blood, or hear the screams. And beneath it all, the city continued unchanged, thriving on fear, chaos, and secrecy, watched carefully by men with ink-stained fingers and hearts that beat in rhythm with the alleys they chronicled. The Thames had always carried more than water. It swallowed bodies, washed away evidence, and reflected the city's secrets like a dark mirror. At the docks, where timber and rope met mud and tide, the river seemed alive, breathing, listening, judging, and in the mist that rolled in from the estuary, the ghosts of London's underworld walked alongside the living, moving unseen, unheard, and often unpaid for. Dockworkers whispered of shadows slipping along the piers. Men unloaded crates, carrying shipments of rum, sugar, and stolen silver, when suddenly a crate would vanish, or a rope would snap. Some swore it was the dockside kings, others the high rip boys, and still others blamed the 40 elephants. But in truth, it was the ghosts. Those who had fallen, vanished, or been erased from ledgers, moved through the fog, invisible but omnipresent. They reminded the living of every debt unpaid, every betrayal unpunished. The ghosts of the docks were not ethereal in the usual sense. They had bodies once, lives once, and ambitions that burned too bright to be snuffed out quietly. One man, named Thomas Hale, had been a dockhand and a thief, caught in a fight over stolen whiskey. His body was never recovered, only a pair of boots floating downstream for days. Yet those who worked the piers swore he walked alongside them at night, silent and cold, eyes glowing in the mist. A warning, a reminder, a reckoning. It was said that the ghosts spoke in whispers no one could hear fully. Messages passed through alleyways and taverns. Debt remembered, betrayal noted, trust nothing. A crate left untended could carry instructions. A rope frayed just enough might cause an accident. The living learned to read these signs, their every movement cautious, deliberate. The docks were no longer just property or territory, they were a conversation between the past and the present. Sometimes the ghosts appeared in subtle ways. A shadow moving against the lamplight, a figure standing motionless as the tide carried away the dead, a single bootprint in the mud where none should exist. Gangs learned to respect them. The dockside kings, despite their power, never stole from crates marked with Hale's initials, and the 40 elephants ensured that shipments left alone were never disturbed by mistake. It was not superstition, it was strategy. London's underworld had learned that ghosts could be allies as well as enemies. By night, the fog thickened, pressing low and damp against the piers. The smell of tar and brine hung heavy, mingling with smoke and the faint stench of spilled whiskey. Footsteps echoed, but no one could tell which belonged to the living. Whispers carried over water, twisting around posts and barrels. The docks themselves became a liminal space, a bridge between the living and the dead, where power was measured not only in fists and knives but in memory and fear. During one particularly foggy December, a shipment of sugar disappeared from a warehouse. The dockside kings blamed a rival gang, while the 40 elephants suspected a thief from the other side of the Thames. Yet when the men investigated, no footprints led anywhere. Only the faint echo of a voice carried on the wind, warning them to pay attention. By morning, the shipment was found stacked neatly at the back of the pier, untouched and unclaimed, as if delivered by invisible hands. The living understood immediately. The ghosts were watching, and their judgment was swift. By dawn, the Thames gleamed weakly beneath the rising sun, hiding its secrets once more. The living moved with caution, the gangs with respect, and the river carried on its eternal work, swallowing what it must, reflecting what it will, and keeping the ghosts of London's docks alive for anyone foolish enough to ignore them. The city was a graveyard and a classroom at once, and in the East End, lessons learned from the dead were worth more than gold. It was the sort of place that smelled of polished leather and tobacco, with velvet curtains heavy enough to muffle the world outside. The city above it glittered with the false innocence of gaslight and cobblestones, but beneath the brass lamps of Pall Mall, men plotted differently. The Gentlemen's Club was a sanctuary of shadow, a hall where manners and murder mingled in ways that most of London could never imagine. Membership was invitation only, and the invitations were as invisible as the deals inside. Lords, merchants, and the occasional rogue attended, all wearing the same mask of civility. Smiles measured, words rehearsed, but inside, each conversation was a negotiation, a lesson in discretion. One could buy silence with a whisper or a smile, trade secrets for influence, and occasionally trade a man's life for profit. The city's wealth flowed into the club quietly, like ink soaking into paper, and no one outside ever knew what had happened. The club was run by a man named Algernon Blackwood, a gentleman in every visible sense, sharp coat, polished boots, and the kind of eyes that calculated without moving. He had learned early that the most profitable crimes were those no one witnessed, that power was as much about illusion as it was about force. Every member trusted him, even as they knew he could betray them with a word. And Blackwood never lied. Not exactly, he merely told truths selectively. Inside, the club hummed with life unseen. Games of chance were more than amusement. They were intelligence tests. Bets were placed not only on cards but on events outside the walls. Which gang would claim the docks? Which shipment would vanish? Which police officer would fail to notice? Each wager carried consequence, and each result reinforced the invisible hierarchy of London. One man's fortune could rise or fall with the passing of a single message. Even the gangs recognized the club's authority, though none dared enter. The dockside kings occasionally left packages near its doors, folded neatly and marked with initials that only Blackwood understood. The 40 elephants occasionally sent letters via couriers who never saw the inside, their messages intended to curry favor or avoid conflict. And the high rip boys, for all their bravado, left the alleyways empty of violence on nights when an agreement had been struck in that smoky chamber above the city. The club did not enforce with knives, it enforced with strategy and the implicit threat of exposure. But there was danger in its elegance. One night, a young man misread the signals, bragging about a theft in the wrong company. By dawn, he was gone, his apartment cleaned of every trace. A single black glove left on his doorstep. The message was clear. The club observed, it judged, and it punished. Fear in the city above was subtle but complete. The Gentlemen's Club had made secrecy sacred. The club's power was reinforced by invisibility. Every guest knew that the city below was a stage, and the clubs were the directors, writing plots that would unfold without ever being seen. Newspapers speculated on new criminal trends, on sudden wealth, on violent deaths, but none could trace them to the velvet halls of Pall Mall. The rules inside were simple. Loyalty was currency, discretion was survival, and knowledge was more valuable than gold. By the time dawn crept across London, the club emptied silently. The fog pressed against the windows, muffling the echoes of laughter, the scratch of quills, and the rustle of silk. And outside, the city woke, unaware that every move it made had been anticipated, measured, and recorded. The Gentlemen's Club ruled not by force but by influence, reminding London quietly and unassailably that sometimes the deadliest weapons were not blades, nor fists, nor fire but knowledge, patience, and the careful cultivation of secrets. By nightfall, Soho was a different city entirely. The gas lamps struggled to penetrate the thick, swirling smoke that rolled up from the kitchens, chimneys, and back alleys. The scent of coal and burnt food mixed with the tang of cheap gin and opium, hanging in the air like a living thing. To the untrained eye, it was just a neighborhood in shadow, but to those who moved within it, gangs, thieves, couriers, and informants, the smoke was a language, a warning, and a cloak all at once. The alleys twisted and narrowed, creating corridors where the fog could thicken unnaturally, hiding hands, eyes, and weapons. The Mohawks prowled here, their movements deliberate and rhythmic. They were different from the High Rip Boys or the Dockside Kings. They were theatrical, unpredictable, and utterly fearless. They carved the streets with their presence alone, and their reputation ensured that even the boldest of thieves would hesitate at a corner or doorway. A glance, a tilt of a hat, or the faintest whisper was enough to tell someone that this street belonged to them, at least for tonight. The 40 elephants, meanwhile, exploited the confusion for their own ends. Women in skirts heavy with stolen silk and hidden coin moved through the fog like spirits. Every shop front, every carriage, every alleyway became a stage for their meticulous heists. And yet, they rarely collided with the Mohawks. Both groups respected the delicate balance of power, the smoke itself acting as a neutral arbiter. One misstep, one loud whisper, and the delicate order could collapse into chaos, blood, and betrayal. At the center of Soho, a fire smoldered in a baker's shop, likely started by a careless chimney or an unwise gang. The smoke mingled with the ever-present fog, thickening to the point where footsteps sounded amplified, echoes bouncing off brick walls and shuttered windows. The constables were nearly blind, their lanterns useless against the choking haze. They moved cautiously, aware that every shadow could conceal a knife or a hidden ally. One wrong turn could cost a man his life, and the city had already proven generous in providing enough wrong turns for anyone. From the rooftops, boys of no more than 12 darted between chimneys, carrying messages or stolen goods. They moved like ghosts, invisible except for the occasional glint of moonlight on their hair or the flash of a coin in their hands. They were trained to respect the smoke, to understand that it could be friend or enemy depending on timing and allegiance. A misjudged step, a misplaced whisper, and the alleys would become traps, with bodies disappearing as if the city itself had swallowed them. By midnight, the streets of Soho were alive in a quiet, deadly rhythm. Doors opened only when allowed, whispers carried orders, and the smoke hung low, as though the city exhaled it deliberately. The gangs thrived, unseen and untouchable, and the rich, insulated in their drawing rooms, remained oblivious. Each corner told a story, every flicker of lamplight a sign of power, and the fog, dense, oppressive, and ever-present, carried the secrets of the city without a single word spoken. As dawn approached, the smoke began to thin, curling upward and dissolving into the morning haze. Shops reopened, taverns filled, and London appeared to breathe once more. Yet the lessons of the night lingered. The Mohawks, the 40 elephants, and the silent watchers of Soho knew that the smoke was more than a veil. It was a sentinel, and in the alleys, beneath every chimney and over every brick, London remembered. Some streets belonged not to law or crown, but to those who moved in the shadows, guided by smoke, silence, and the careful balance of power. Clerkenwell had always been a crossroads, a place where merchants, artisans, and labourers collided, and where every corner hid a secret or a deal gone wrong. By the late 1880s, it had become more than that. It was the birthplace of a power so quiet, so methodical, that even the gangs who ruled the East End paused when it was whispered. They called it the Black Hand. It started with whispers in taverns and back rooms, strangers from the continent, speaking in clipped vowels and moving with a rhythm unfamiliar to London. They carried little but knives, coins, and promises. Unlike the Mohawks or the 40 Elephants, they did not seek fame in the streets. Their reputation was built on fear, the kind that travels unseen and arrives unannounced. Merchants paid for protection without asking questions. Policemen reported odd disappearances with shrugs. The fog itself seemed to bend around their movement. The Black Hand's methods were precise. Messages were delivered in code. A folded napkin left in a pub, a chalk mark on a doorframe, the faint scent of tar on a doorstep. The order of events mattered more than the events themselves. One misstep, a coin taken too early, a shipment moved at the wrong hour, and the offender would vanish. Sometimes he was found days later, sometimes never. The message, however, was always clear. The Black Hand observed everything, and their judgment was absolute. They were not a gang in the conventional sense. There were no uniforms, no ranks visibly displayed, no public meetings. Instead, they were a network of men and women, connected through commerce, fear, and loyalty. A warehouse owner might find a knife slipped under his door, paired with a letter in a language only he understood. A ship captain might discover a barrel missing, replaced by a note etched in ash. Next time, comply. Every action, every failure, every small defiance was noted, recorded, and repaid in kind. The East End quickly learned the rules. Even the most violent of London's street gangs, the High Rip Boys, the Dockside Kings, and the Razor Men recognized when the Black Hand had passed. Fights stopped at their approach. Thefts were redirected. Shipments rerouted. Even the 40 Elephants, masters of disguise and strategy, altered their patterns to avoid direct conflict. No one questioned the authority of the Black Hand. It was felt in the unease of the streets and the subtle obedience of the merchants. One night in December, a shipment of whiskey bound for Bermondsey disappeared from the docks. The Dockside Kings blamed each other. The police investigated in vain. Weeks later, the same shipment reappeared in Clerkenwell, stacked perfectly and untouched, a gift or a warning, depending on who saw it. The Black Hand had communicated silently. They could take, they could return, and they could punish. No one could predict what would come next, but everyone understood that nothing would happen by chance. By dawn, the streets of Clerkenwell looked ordinary. Children ran to school, shopkeepers opened doors, and smoke from bakeries mingled with fog. Yet beneath the surface, London's criminal world had shifted. The Black Hand was not a presence to be seen, but a force to be acknowledged. Its influence threaded through alleyways, warehouses, pubs, and docks alike. The city, ever chaotic and hungry, had found a new master, one who needed no herald, no noise, no blood spilled in the streets to prove authority. The East End never forgot. The Black Hand remained a shadow, a whisper, and a lesson that in London, power was not measured by the size of a gang or the sharpness of a knife, but by patience, precision, and the invisible threads that bind every man, woman, and child to the streets they walk. Lambeth was a neighborhood built of brick, soot, and stubbornness. Its streets curved and twisted like the coils of a serpent, alleys hidden between tenements and taverns, hiding more than just secrets. From these alleys emerged a group of youths whose reputations would stretch far beyond their district, the Lambeth Boys. They were born of hardship, trained by necessity, and tempered by the unyielding rhythm of London's underworld. At first, they were children of circumstance, fathers lost to dock accidents or debt, mothers bound to washhouses and factories. School was a luxury they could not afford, play a dangerous distraction. By the age of 10, many of them had learned the street's language of whispers, glances, and avoidance. By 12, they carried knives as naturally as a shepherd carried a staff, and by 15, they were leaders in their own right, teaching younger boys the lessons they had learned in blood and soot. The Lambeth boys were not the city's most elegant thieves. They didn't wear silk gloves or silk scarves. They moved in the mud and smoke, boots caked with grime, eyes sharp and wary. Their skill was not in subtlety but in speed, in adaptability, in knowing the city better than anyone else. They could vanish into the fog, slip past constables, and return with what they came for: a purse, a parcel, a promise, extracted in fear. They thrived where other gangs hesitated, where the alleys bent too sharply for outsiders to follow. Territory was everything. Each street and back alley had its boundaries, and crossing them without permission was punished swiftly. The Lambeth boys defended their claims not only with fists and knives, but with intelligence. Scouts watched for rivals, for police, for merchants who might hire outsiders to spy. Messages were passed silently. Knocks on barrels, chalk marks on doors, small tokens left at corners. It was a system learned from the dockside kings and the Mohawks, refined by necessity, and executed without hesitation. One cold winter night, a rival gang from Bermondsey attempted to infiltrate Lambeth territory. The streets were slick with rain and ice, and fog thickened with every passing hour. The Lambeth boys had anticipated the intrusion. Scouts had signaled, boys had taken positions along rooftops and in shadowed doorways. When the Bermondsey gang arrived, they found the alleys empty, doors slammed in their faces. From above, rain-soaked figures dropped down behind them, knives flashing in the dim lamplight. The invaders fled, some injured, some humiliated, and none returned. Despite their brutality, the Lambeth boys had their own code. Younger boys were trained and protected. Women who passed through their territory unharmed were respected. Mistakes were punished, but unnecessary cruelty was discouraged, a lesson learned early in the alleys, where overreach could invite the wrath of every gang in the district. Survival depended on discipline as much as courage, and every boy knew that instinct alone would not suffice. By dawn, the fog lifted, revealing a city unchanged to outsiders but entirely different to those who knew its rhythm. The Lambeth boys disappeared into shadows, their boots no longer striking cobbles, but absorbed into memory. They were young, dangerous, and indispensable to the balance of London's underworld, children of smoke, masters of the alley, and rulers of a kingdom no map could mark. And as the city stirred beneath the gaslight, whispers carried through the streets. The Lambeth boys had been there, and wherever they walked, silence, fear, and respect followed in equal measure. There was a building in the East End that no map would mark, no constable could find without guidance, and no outsider could enter twice. It was called the Crime School, not in jest, not officially, but because it functioned as exactly that, a classroom where the city's lost children were trained in the arts of survival, deception, and lawless mastery. The school was hidden behind the façade of an abandoned warehouse. Windows were boarded, doors bolted, and a single flickering lantern outside was the only signal of life. Inside, the smell of damp timber and candle smoke mingled with the tang of sweat and stolen coal dust. The floorboards creaked beneath the boots of children who had learned too early that silence could be as deadly as a knife. The headmaster was a man called Reuben Marsh, a former pickpocket who had survived every raid, every fight, every betrayal the East End could throw at him. He had no patience for weakness and no tolerance for foolishness. A mistake in the alley, he would tell his pupils, can become your obituary in the morning paper. His lessons were practical: lockpicking, sleight of hand, observation, and when necessary, the careful use of knives and blunt force. But he also taught subtler skills: reading people, anticipating movement, and understanding the unspoken rules of the city's underworld. The students were orphans, street children, and runaways, some no older than 8, others in their early teens. Reuben trained them with a strict hierarchy. The fastest runners carried messages, the cleverest planned diversions, and the bravest executed the thefts. Each student was evaluated constantly. A single error could mean humiliation, a bruised body, or expulsion into the streets, a fate many did not survive. But those who succeeded were rewarded with food, clothing, and, most importantly, respect. One day, Reuben introduced a new lesson: teamwork. A pair of boys was tasked with lifting a crate of cloth from a warehouse without being seen. The older boy had to cover the younger's mistakes. The younger had to anticipate the older's needs. The exercise was brutal, simulated guards, hidden witnesses, and penalties for noise or hesitation. By the end of the night, both boys emerged, exhausted, covered in soot, but alive and victorious. Reuben nodded once. "The city doesn't forgive mistakes," he said, "but it rewards cleverness. Remember that." The crime school also taught subtlety and morality as much as the East End allowed. Children were warned against harming innocents unnecessarily. They learned to distinguish between someone who could be coerced and someone who could destroy them. A map of the city's alleys was etched in their minds, memorized through practice, observation, and storytelling. By the time they left, they were capable of moving unseen, stealing silently, and surviving in ways even seasoned gangs would envy. By night, the East End became their playground. Messages were carried, packages intercepted, rival gangs observed, but always with the discipline Reuben had instilled. They knew when to strike, when to vanish, and when to wait. Mistakes were punished, success rewarded, and the city itself became both a lesson and a test. When dawn came, the children returned to the warehouse. Some slept, others cleaned, all listened. Reuben spoke softly, his words cutting sharper than knives. "The city is your teacher. The alleys are your classroom. Learn everything. Trust no one. Survive, always." And so it continued, the crime school, shaping the East End's youth. One careful step, one lesson, in shadows at a time. By the time they emerged fully grown, the pupils were masters, thieves, spies, and survivors, ready to claim the streets as their own. The crime school had done its work, leaving behind a generation who knew that in London, education came not from books, but from the fog, the brick, and the endless, unforgiving rhythm of the alleys. She moved like a shadow in the fog, her skirts brushing wet cobblestones, the hem of her blue dress almost glowing beneath the dim lamplight. No one knew her name. Some whispered she had once been a seamstress, others that she had come from the West End, exiled from gentility for reasons no one dared repeat. But by the time she appeared in Whitechapel, she had become a force that the gangs both feared and admired. The woman in the blue dress was not violent by necessity. She did not carry a knife like the razor men or strike like the high rip boys. Her weapon was observation, patience, and subtle manipulation. She moved through taverns and alleys as if invisible, listening to whispers, noting glances, and memorizing habits. To her, every person, every alleyway, every flickering lamplight was a puzzle, one that could be solved without blood, though blood was never far from the equation if the need arose. The 40 elephants had crossed paths with her once, and their leader, Alice, Diamond, had recognized talent. The woman could intercept shipments, gather secrets, and vanish without leaving a trace. She was invaluable for intelligence. She never stole for the sake of theft, nor did she traffic violence unnecessarily. Instead, she used her presence to influence outcomes. A missing ledger, a delayed shipment, a carefully whispered rumor, all could be traced back to her delicate, calculating hand. Her blue dress became her signature. Even from a distance, the color marked her passage. Men in the streets learned to note it and adjust their actions accordingly. Some tried to follow, hoping to capture her or uncover her secrets. But the fog always seemed to favor her. She could vanish into shadows, duck behind barrels, or slip into a doorway unnoticed. And by the time anyone realized she had been there, the consequences of her movements had already taken effect. One evening, she intercepted a shipment of silver coins meant for the dockside kings. The men, responsible were unaware until dawn that their cargo had been diverted. No notes, no threats, no sign of violence. Yet by morning, every gang knew the blue dress had passed through, and the dockside kings themselves begrudgingly respected her. Her influence grew not through fear of death, but through certainty. She always got what she wanted, and the city silently acknowledged it. Even the constables were not immune. They noticed her too late, always a second behind. A lantern would catch the shimmer of blue, but by the time they arrived at the scene, she was gone, leaving only empty crates, missing coins, and questions no one could answer. Rumors claimed she had informants in every district, a network so subtle that even the gangs themselves could not map it fully. Yet she was not invincible. Some nights, the fog betrayed her. A corner cut too sharply, a whisper overheard, and she narrowly escaped the consequences of miscalculation. But the woman in the blue dress had learned the city's rhythms, its habits, and its weaknesses. She adapted, vanished, and reappeared elsewhere, always ahead of danger, always shaping events without being touched by them. By dawn, the alleys of Whitechapel were quiet, save for the occasional clatter of carts and the distant toll of a bell. Somewhere, a blue thread of silk brushed against brick, leaving behind a faint impression, a memory of her presence. The gangs whispered her name, though not her real name, and every child of the streets knew that wherever she moved, the city shifted in response. The woman in the blue dress was a ghost, a tactician, and a ruler of secrets, and London would never forget the shadow she cast beneath its fog. Fear in London was not a sudden thing. It did not arrive as a scream or a blow. It crept, slowly, measured and precise, curling through the alleys like smoke from a dying fire. It was the language everyone spoke but few admitted. In the East End, fear had a shape, a rhythm, and an anatomy, and it was taught early, like breathing. Children learned first. They understood which streets to avoid, which faces promised danger, and which doors offered sanctuary. The High Rip Boys, the Razor Men, the 40 Elephants, and even the Mohawks all became instructors in this silent curriculum. A glance, a gesture, the faintest shift in shadow could teach lessons far deeper than a lecture ever could. Fear was the first teacher, the first law, and the first currency in London's underworld. For the adults, the anatomy of fear was more complex. Merchants and tradesmen measured it in loss and profit. Shopkeepers learned to leave coins under mats or notes tucked inside ledgers, offering tribute to side gangs in exchange for a night without violence. Dockworkers counted the tides and the direction of the fog, knowing that wrong steps could lead to broken bones or worse. Families whispered lessons to children, reminding them never to speak too loudly, to note the timing of footsteps, and to recognize the glint of a knife before it found them. Fear had layers, each building upon the other. The first was anticipation, the knowledge that violence could arrive at any moment. The second was observation, the ability to read the streets, the faces, and the shadows. The third was consequence, understanding that mistakes could cost a life, a limb, or a livelihood. To master fear was to survive it, and in London, survival required constant vigilance. Constables learned the anatomy of fear the hard way. Even Saint Light, Henry Pritchard, who had walked the streets for decades, discovered that fear could not be combated with law alone. It had to be respected, studied, and accounted for. Were adjusted, lanterns held higher, and every alley scrutinized. But the gangs adapted faster. They knew the men who chased them, their routines, and their weaknesses. Fear, in their hands, became a weapon as sharp as any knife or razor. One night in Bethnal Green, a shipment of rum was targeted by a group of boys no older than 14. They had observed the guards, calculated the tides, and waited for the exact moment when the fog swallowed every lamplight. By the time the constables reacted, the shipment was gone. The merchants trembled not because of theft, but because they knew the boys had watched, waited, and struck without hesitation. Fear had been taught, and the lesson was complete. Even within the gangs, fear was anatomy in action. Initiates were tested left alone in alleys, tasked with moving stolen goods, challenged to survive encounters with rival members. Every test measured courage, patience, and cunning. Mistakes were punished. Successes were rewarded. By the 1906 end, the children became adults, not just skilled in theft or violence, but fluent in fear itself, knowing when to run, when to strike, and when to wait for the inevitable. By dawn, London appeared unchanged. Merchants opened their doors, children played, and fog lifted slightly along the Thames. Yet beneath the surface, the anatomy of fear pulsed steadily through the streets, invisible, patient, and perfectly calibrated. It had taught its lessons well, and those who had learned it knew, deep in their bones, that in the East End, fear was not just survival, it was the law, the teacher, and the unseen ruler of every street and alley. The day began with silence. Not the kind of silence that comforts, but the kind that presses against your chest, heavy and relentless. London held its breath as the sky lightened over the East End. It was morning, yes, but for the streets, it was an awakening of dread the day of the hanging. Word had spread through the alleys like smoke. One of the high-rip boys, caught in a series of petty thefts and a few more serious crimes, was to pay the ultimate price. The streets filled slowly with the city's denizens. Shopkeepers opened doors with hesitant hands. Children peeked from behind frosted windows, and the fog that had clung to the city through the night thinned only enough to reveal faces. Everyone knew the rules. Witness, whisper, retreat. The hanging was public, but the lessons were private, drilled into every boy and girl who had learned what survival demanded. Fear was currency, and today it was being paid in full. Constables lined the square near the gallows, polished, boots gleaming, lanterns still smouldering from the previous night's patrols. They stood like statues, prepared for anything, for riot, for escape, for the faintest spark of defiance. Yet none dared to meet the eyes of the crowd for long. London's East End had learned that civility was a thin veneer, and any slip of sympathy could cost more than a badge. The condemned man arrived in a carriage, hooded and silent, flanked by officers who knew their duty but not the depth of what awaited. Along the route, the alleys were alive with observation. The 40 elephants had stationed girls in doorways to watch for any attempt at rescue. The Mohawks waited on rooftops, knives concealed beneath coats, ready to intervene if chaos erupted. Even the dockside kings had a few men in the crowd, curious about the spectacle, calculating potential advantage. Every gang, every observer, every child in the East End understood the ritual. The executioner mounted the scaffold, his hands steady on the ropes. Silence fell heavier than any night fog. The condemned man shuffled to the edge, the weight of the city pressing down with him. Somewhere beyond the square, a church bell tolled a slow, mournful note, its echo swallowed by the surrounding streets. For a moment, time itself seemed suspended, caught between life and death, observation and participation. Then the noose was placed, the crowd held its collective breath, and the rope drew tight. The city exhaled. Lessons were delivered. The streets learned again. The law could strike, consequences could be swift, and obedience was not optional. But the fear did not belong solely to the condemned. Every child who witnessed the event, every boy who had run with the gangs, every merchant and dockworker watching cautiously from their doors, absorbed it. The anatomy of fear was reaffirmed, reinforced in flesh, memory, and shadow. By the afternoon, the square emptied. The gallows stood silent, the ropes swaying slightly in the breeze. Shops reopened, markets resumed their noise, and the fog began to curl once more through the streets. But the memory of that morning lingered in every alley, every doorway, every cobblestone. London remembered who ruled its streets, what power looked like, and what happened to those who misstepped. The hanging morning was more than justice, it was pedagogy. The city itself taught obedience, respect, and terror, the curriculum that every gang, child, and observer understood without explanation. And beneath the fog, Beneath the gaslight, beneath the bricks and mortar of the East End, the lessons of fear and survival continued, ever alive, ever patient, and impossible to forget. By the time the city had recovered from the hanging morning, London was ripe for a different kind of order. The fog had thinned in some streets, yet thickened in others, curling over cobblestones, like the memory of a threat that would not fade. The gangs, the high rip boys, the 40 elephants, the razor men, and the dockside kings had learned the lessons of fear, silence, and consequence. But even they could not resist the pressure of a new authority. The Metropolitan Police had reorganized, armed with more men, more lanterns, and, for the first time, a system that aimed to understand the East End on its own terms. The new law was not written in ink or proclamations. It was a framework built from observation, patrol, and hierarchy. Precincts were reorganized, officers assigned by district, and detailed maps were drawn to note alleys, passages, and blind spots. Stations were no longer passive outposts. They became command centers, coordinating raids, tracking reports, predicting criminal movement. Londoners could not see the changes, but they felt them, a tension in the air, the subtle pressure of unseen eyes watching. For the gangs, it was an unwelcome shift. The high rip boys had relied on mobility and fear. The dockside kings depended on anonymity. The 40 elephants moved under the radar. Now, patterns were observed, footprints tracked, and information gathered with a precision the streets had never encountered. A shipment intercepted today could be reported tomorrow, and a boy who whispered too much might be caught in a coordinated sweep. The new law was both visible and invisible. It touched everything without being obvious. Constable Bramley, still called Saint Light by some, was placed in charge of coordinating patrols in the East End. His knowledge of the alleys, the gangs, and the city's rhythms was invaluable. He trained younger officers to move like shadows, to recognize subtle signs of trouble, and to anticipate violence before it erupted. Under his guidance, the new law became more than enforcement. It became strategy, a calculated extension of presence that aimed to make the streets predictable. The first true test came one fog-drenched November evening. The high rip boys had planned a raid on a warehouse near Whitechapel. Word had reached the constables through a network of informants and careful observation. Officers arrived in precise formation, lanterns swinging just enough to illuminate the fog without betraying their position. The gang, expecting chaos, found coordination instead. Exits blocked, movements anticipated, their own tactics mirrored against them. A few were arrested, others fled, and the shipment remained untouched. It was the first victory of the new law, and its lesson reverberated throughout the East End. Yet even with structure and planning, the law was imperfect. The alleys were alive in ways that maps and patrols could not contain. The fog bent light and sound, hiding children, messages, and thieves alike. The 40 elephants continued to intercept shipments under cover of dawn, and the razor men adapted to move faster, strike harder, and vanish before the constables could act. The new law had made progress, but it had also created a new game, one that tested intelligence, patience, and creativity. By dawn, London returned to its usual rhythm. Markets opened, children ran to school, and the fog curled lazily along the streets. But beneath the ordinary, beneath the commerce and chatter, the new law had changed the game. Gangs moved with caution, constables with strategy, and the East End, ever resilient, learned that authority could be planned for but never fully conquered. The city itself seemed to exhale that morning, a pause before the inevitable. London had learned a new rhythm, and the streets, while never tamed, had felt the weight of something larger than fear. Structure. The new law had arrived, and the game had only just begun. The city had changed, though only in ways the fog and brick could perceive. Lanterns swung more carefully. Constables moved with a precision that mirrored the gang's own rhythms, and whispers traveled faster than footsteps. Among those who remembered the old ways, only a few remained, and of them, The razor men were nearly extinct. The last of their breed, a boy-turned-man named Silas Crow, carried the weight of an entire generation on his shoulders. Silas had begun as all razor men did, young, hungry, and taught that survival was sharpened steel. He learned in alleyways where blood marked lessons more clearly than chalk or ink. Knives were not simply weapons. They were punctuation, dictating the rhythm of the streets, and he had mastered every inflection. By 18, he commanded respect from peers and fear from rivals. But the new law, the reorganized constabulary, and the rise of cleverer, more organized gangs had eroded the old order. One by one, his comrades had vanished, arrested, dead, or absorbed into other crews, leaving him alone, a relic of violence and instinct in a city moving toward strategy and calculation. Despite the dwindling numbers, Silas remained a figure of legend. He haunted the alleys of Whitechapel and Limehouse, moving silently under gaslight, watching, listening. Children whispered about the ghost with the blade, a boy who could appear and vanish in the same breath. His reputation grew not from stories told in the newspapers. The writers had begun focusing on the new law and the quieter, more profitable heists of the 40 Elephants, but from encounters in the dark, a missed strike, a stolen shipment recovered, a rival's pride shredded by a flick of his wrist. On a November night, Silas faced a choice that would define his survival. A shipment of contraband whiskey had been left unguarded near the docks. The High Rip Boys, now a shadow of their former selves, intended to take it, while the dockside kings sought to reclaim territory. Silas had no allegiance, only instinct. He studied the crates from the shadows, the fog masking his movements. One misstep, and he would be caught between two rival gangs no longer protected by numbers, only by the skill honed through years of survival. He moved with the precision of a shadow, cutting a line between the two groups, taking only what he needed and leaving behind a message written in ash and chalk, a single mark indicating that the razor men still existed and that those who underestimated them would pay a price. The two gangs clashed behind him, their violence audible but irrelevant to Silas. By the time the first constables arrived, drawn by the noise, the crates had been cleared, the alley was empty, and only the echoes of chaos remained. The last of the razor boys did not linger in legend for glamour or fame. He lingered because he understood the rhythm of the city, the language of fear, and the limits of violence. While the 40 Elephants, the Mohawks, and the dockside kings adapted to the new law, Silas remained a reminder of a different era, one where instinct was power and a knife could dictate the terms of survival. By dawn, London continued its indifferent march. The fog rolled back across the alleys, muffling footsteps and erasing evidence of the night's skirmishes. Silas vanished with it, another shadow among shadows, leaving behind only the memory of what it meant to be untouchable in a city that was slowly learning to measure law above terror. The razor men were gone, almost, but their last boy, silent, sharp, and patient, ensured that the old lessons were never fully forgotten. London glimmered in the daylight, proud and polished above, yet beneath the gaslight and fog, the city's true empire moved unseen. The streets, alleys, and docks had always belonged to those who understood them, not the merchants, not the magistrates, and certainly not the constables. Even as the Queen's peace and the new law extended their reach, the shadow of the old order persisted, a kingdom of cunning, fear, and whispers that refused to be tamed. The gangs, once sprawling and violent, had learned adaptation. The High Rip Boys had fractured, the razor men were nearly extinct, and the dockside kings had become careful administrators of their riverside wealth. Yet the legacy of power lived on. The 40 Elephants continued to strike with subtlety and precision. The Mohawks haunted the theatre districts with intimidation and reputation, and remnants of older crews, the children of smoke, the apprentices of the crime school, continued to learn and evolve in silence. The city was full of actors who understood instinct more than law, patience more than force, and observation more than words. Beneath the empire of brick and commerce, the shadow moved like a living organism. Messages passed unseen. A tipped lantern, a dropped coin, a mark in chalk or ash. Observers, spies, and scouts documented every motion, learning which alleys could be traversed safely, which pubs concealed watchful eyes, and which intersections had long memories. Even the constables, vigilant and organized, were forced to acknowledge the invisible system that guided the streets. They could react, but they could not anticipate fully. The shadow thrived on uncertainty, and London's surface splendor was only the mask of what truly governed the East End. Silas Crowe, the last of the Razor Boys, moved through it, a ghost among ghosts. He had witnessed the rise and fall of empires built on fear, the discipline of the crime school, the cunning of Alice Diamond, and the quiet intelligence of the woman in the blue dress. He knew that London's power was no longer measured by sheer violence, but by patience and subtlety. One carefully placed mark, one silent intervention, one observation noted, could shift the balance between survival and ruin. To the people above, the city seemed orderly. To those who moved in its shadows, every step was a negotiation with forces they could feel but not see. Even the Thames carried memory of the shadow. The docks, where the dockside kings had once ruled, were mapped with invisible lines of loyalty, fear, and debt. A single miscalculation could undo weeks of planning, and the ghosts of those lost to the river reminded everyone that the city was patient but not forgiving. Lessons in consequence were written in silence, in absence, in bodies that never returned. By dusk, the gaslights flickered and the fog returned, curling through alleys, under doorways, and along the brick walls like smoke in a cathedral. The empire above could not reach it. No law could fully pierce it. Every gang, every thief, every child who had learned the rhythm of fear and survival contributed to the pattern. London's shadow was not a single person, nor a single gang. It was an ecosystem, a network, a consciousness born from decades of crime, cunning, and observation. And as night fell completely, the city seemed to breathe. Footsteps moved quietly through alleys, messages passed without words, and somewhere a knife flashed in the dim lamplight. The empire above ruled by law and declaration, but beneath it, the shadow ruled by understanding, patience, and memory. London had two masters, one visible, one invisible, and it was the shadow patient, silent, and eternal that ensured the city would never truly be tamed. The fog arrived every evening like a tide, curling through the East End and swallowing streets whole. It carried the smell of coal, smoke, and the river, thickening the air until even the lamps seemed hesitant to burn. Within its folds moved the city's youngest, most adaptable residents, the children of the fog. They were orphans, beggars, and street urchins, hardened by hunger and trained by necessity. To them, the fog was both shield and teacher, a cloak that allowed them to move unseen while instilling lessons about survival that adults would struggle to learn. These children were masters of observation. They knew every alleyway, every corner, every hidden doorway where shadows could be found. A misplaced glance could cost a life. A slip of the tongue could mean the difference between a coin in the hand and a fist in the face. The older children trained the younger ones, passing down what the city had taught them: how to avoid detection, how to read the intentions in a man's compactor stride, how to vanish when the danger approached. It was a curriculum written in fog, footfalls, and whispered warnings. Some of the children had been raised by gangs, the High Rip Boys, the Dockside Kings, and even the 40 Elephants had accepted apprentices. Others learned independently, observing the city as if it were a book. The children of the fog were everywhere, perched on rooftops, darting through back alleys, slipping silently behind barrels and carts. They watched, listened, and reported. A single signal, a tap on a post, a chalk mark, a thrown pebble, could convey entire messages between children miles apart. The fog carried their signals as efficiently as it hid them. The adult gangs relied on them more than they admitted. A missing shipment, a rival's approach, a policeman's patrol, the children's eyes were everywhere. And yet, the adults never controlled them completely. The children had independence born of necessity. They knew the streets better than anyone, and were loyal only to the city itself, to the rules etched into brick and cobblestone. Those rules were simple: survive, observe, and obey the lessons of the fog. One particular evening, a boy named Elias and a girl named Tilly undertook a task that would define their mastery. A crate of silver had been left unguarded near the docks. They watched from rooftops as shadows moved below, measuring each step, each glance. The fog thickened, hiding them perfectly. In silence, they descended, intercepted the crate, and vanished into an alley before the guards could even notice the theft. Their reward was minimal, a coin, a loaf of bread, but their lesson was immense. The fog had protected them, but it had also tested their patience, judgment, and instincts. By dawn, the East End seemed ordinary. Smoke rose from chimneys, shopkeepers opened their doors, and children reappeared in the streets as if nothing had happened. Yet the fog had left its mark. The children had learned, survived, and adapted once more. Every night the cycle repeated. The city taught, the fog concealed, and the children of the streets grew sharper, faster, and more cunning. The adults noticed the change in them only rarely. To the gangs, these children were useful tools. To the constables, they were nuisances. But the children of the fog belonged to no one. They were the inheritors of London's secrets, the silent watchers, the invisible rulers of alleys. And as the fog curled through the East End again, it carried them like ghosts, reminding the city that the streets were never truly empty, and that knowledge, patience, and survival belonged first to those who moved unseen beneath the mist. By the time midnight fell, London was alive in a way that no visitor could comprehend. The city pulsed with a rhythm unseen, a cadence dictated not by bells or carriages, but by the movement of shadows along the cobblestones. Gas lamps flickered, but their light only partially illuminated the streets, leaving pockets of darkness where the city's true rulers, the gangs, the children, and the invisible networks thrived. London did not sleep. It inhaled and exhaled in fog, whispers, and the faint scrape of boots against stone. Every alley had its lessons. The high-rip boys, though diminished, still marked territory with quiet threats, guiding intruders with a glance or a gesture. The dockside kings monitored the river, ensuring that shipments moved only where they permitted, their eyes as sharp as ever despite the encroachment of the new law. The 40 elephants continued to operate with silent precision, slipping through shops and warehouses like ghosts in silk and crinoline, leaving behind only empty pockets and unanswered questions. And above all, the children of the fog moved with the city, learning, observing, and teaching each other the anatomy of survival. In the East End, the fog was both veil and teacher. It concealed misdeeds and highlighted dangers, carrying the lessons of yesterday into the present. One could step into it and vanish completely, becoming part of London's rhythm. It taught patience, anticipation, and silence. A boy might run for a coin, a girl might follow footsteps unseen, a gang could coordinate an entire heist, all without leaving a mark on the wider world. The fog was not merely air and water. It was a guide, a guardian, and, for those who understood it, a companion. The constables moved differently now. Saint Light had trained them to observe, to anticipate, and to adapt, yet even they were only partially effective. The new law had imposed order in theory, but the city's underworld had adapted faster. Intelligence, networks were invisible, strategies were fluid, and every alleyway held the memory of 100 lessons taught by fear and necessity. Police patrols could catch some, but the rhythm of the streets belonged to those who had been raised by it. Even the ghostly remnants of the past lingered. Silas Crow, the last razor boy, moved like a shadow in the fog, teaching the rhythm of knives to anyone who would learn. The orphan queen's influence persisted in whispers and hidden signals. The woman in the blue dress continued her work, shaping events without a trace. London's underworld was alive not because of blood or fire alone, but because memory and instruction carried forward, guiding new generations to mastery in silence. By dawn, the city's surface would appear calm. Shops opened, markets hummed, and carriages rattled over cobblestones. But the streets remembered the night. Every scar, every mark, every whisper persisted in the shadows. London's underworld had trained its successors in ways that law and authority could never erase. The city that never sleeps did not merely endure. It instructed, observed, and adapted. And as the fog curled back in for the next night, as lanterns flickered uncertainly along the streets, the message remained clear. The city belonged to no one, yet to everyone who understood its rhythm. The Queen's peace, the new law, the gangs, and the orphans all were part of the same pulse. London's underworld thrived because it was patient, cunning, and eternal. The city never truly slept, and its lessons never truly ended. In every shadow, behind every door, beneath every lamplight, the East End continued its quiet reign, a kingdom of fog, fear, and memory that would outlast every king, constable, and law that dared to challenge it.